Sorry for the delay. We always promise that we never organize hybrid events, but it's cheaper to organize hybrid events rather than bringing everyone to Ottawa. So we have some issues with online presenters, but hopefully by the time we get there, they will be able to connect. Thank you so much for coming this morning to the event titled NATO at Crossroads, Present Challenges and Future Trajectories, organized by the Eastern Europe and Transatlantic Network, together with NATO Association of Canada. My name is Leuprecht, and I'm an associate professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. And I'm also one of the leaders, together with my colleague Paul Good and Professor Jeff Sahadeo, of the Eastern Europe and Transatlantic Network, who is hosted by the Institute at Carleton. Just to give you a bit of background, the network is an initiative funded by the Department of National Defense under one of their the Mobilizing Insights and Defense and Security Funding programs. And the main goal is to provide a critical perspective on the political, economic, and societal impacts of the Russian war in Ukraine. And the three main areas of interest are European security, Eurasian security architecture, and the Arctic security. In addition, our co-organizer, NATO Association of Canada, probably most of you are already familiar with them. Their main mission is to educate and engage Canadians about NATO and the NATO goals of peace, prosperity, and security. So we are very happy to be able to collaborate with them in the organization of this event. And given the brief description of our objectives, clearly this event is consistent with the overarching objectives of our both associations. So, since its founding in 1949, NATO has embodied the principle that Europe's security and North American security are inseparable. And that mainly, as we all know, it was established to contain the Soviet expansion and safeguard shared democratic norms. NATO became the foundation of the transatlantic security community throughout the Cold War era. Once the Cold War ended, it redefined its purpose to deal with new issues that came up with important. And the main goal was to preserve the political, military, and normative bonds that tied its members together. However, the illegal Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have dramatically reshaped NATO's priorities, reaffirming collective defense again as a central purpose. For example, the 2022 Madrid summit, the alliance adopted the new strategic concept, identifying Russia as the most significant and direct threat to Allied security, pledging to defend every inch of the Allied territory and strengthen deterrence through larger combat-ready multi-domain forces. Yet, NATO's recent transformation has also been shaped by internal pressure, particularly debate over the US commitment to the alliance, uncertainty regarding President Trump's stance towards Russia and Ukraine and NATO, his verbal attacks on certain NATO allies, and the US demands for increased defense spending contributed to growing anxiety among European allies, and especially of the one closer to us, such as Poland and the Baltic states. So, based on this background, the event invites reflections on how the alliance can preserve its unity, to adapt to shifting geopolitical realities and define strategic direction in an era of renewed military-bound competition. And I think we are very lucky, or that discussing earlier on, that we have with us distinguished academic and policy experts who can discuss NATO's current challenges, its evolving role in global security, and of course, Canada's role within NATO, and trajectories for its future development. So without taking much of your time, I will move on into the first panel, but before that, I would like to acknowledge that the land that which we gathered is the traditional city territory of the Algonquin Nation. And in doing so, we acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adapt to Algonquin cultural protocols. And having said that, I would like to introduce again my colleague, Dr. Paul Wood, who is the McMillan Chair in Russian Politics in the Institute of European Russian and Iranian Studies at Carleton University. He is, as I mentioned, one of the leaders of the Transatlantic network, and he will introduce our first panelist and will moderate the discussion of the first panel. And I would
Yeah, I'd like to invite the speaker of the first panel. Please come up and take some seats here. We have 4 in person and 3 online. We have 2 and 2 over here. So the first panel is dedicated to academic perspectives on the challenges facing NATO and its members. Of course, many of our speakers are directly involved in policy work as well, or varying political hats. The order for the panel will have a round of questions or presentations for each speaker. And I would ask each of our speakers, please keep your initial round of comments to about 10 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have about half an hour of questions from the audience. For those of you who are following online, Q&A has been enabled for the event on Teams, so you can post your questions to the speakers there, and they'll be directed to me to ask their speakers. We will start, I believe, not necessarily the order of the trends, but I'd like to start first of all with Dr. Christian Leuprecht, who is professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada at Queen's University, and is senior fellow at the McDonald-Laurier Institute. He's a recognized expert on security and defense, political demography, and comparative federalism. Dr. Leuprecht has published extensively, including 9 books and numerous articles in leading journals. He regularly provides expert testimony in parliament and contributes editorials to national media and offers commentary on domestic and international affairs. And Professor Leuprecht, I believe you have a presentation prepared on future challenges of transatlantic security. So I'll hand it over to you and use the microphone.
Should I just do the drill sergeant version? Is that all right?
Oh, I think
Yeah. Smoke signals on that. All right. Okay. So this is just a little PR for a workshop we did, but it's nobody writes domestic operations. So there's the best 26 countries in it, including some. Colleagues from South Africa to develop sociologists. If that's a really interesting use of the use of the militaries across the world for operations that evaders that they're used to. And the other piece that I did for studies on why it seems to be so different social groups can get their act together, they're working together. We cross the Revenor's Transatlantic Triangle, and so that we can think about Washington, Ottawa, and New York, more in sort of a triangle fashion, like how we counterbalance and all right, so the 9 minutes that we have left here. So this is sort of the quick sort of overview of sort of what I have in mind here. So 2 quick points here. So the reason why I put up a map is if you look about where the center of gravity is shifting, right? So in ancient times, center of gravity was Mediterranean. Then sort of with the period of colonization, the Atlantic became the center of gravity of sort of global politics. And now the center of gravity has shifted to the Indo-Pacific and to the Pacific Ocean. With the end of World War II, the US implemented a different type of grand strategy. The US realized that it needed a rim strategy. So that's to say that the security of North America and the continent depended on the security on either side of the rim, so both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean.
Pardon me.
And that came with three strategic priorities for the U.S. On the one hand, territorial integrity, economic prosperity, social harmony, and political stability in Europe, and the defense of Europe. But also, if you think about the Indo-Pacific priorities for the United States, avoiding that any one power would dominate the Eurasian landmass, and that no Navy, obviously U.S. Navy, would dominate in the Pacific Oceans. And so if you think about that from a grand strategy perspective, where are U.S. interests of a strategic threat? Not in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, both at land and at sea. This is just to counter some of the misperceptions that people have. So the U.S. global military presence since 1950, and you can see sort of the very rapid decline of that presence, and also the unpredictability and diversity of U.S. basic posture overseas. So all the people who think that the world, the sky is falling, there was things that Trump is doing. This dates back to well before the Trump era, and so we had lots of time to prepare for this era. But of course, the good comments that we just simply decide to ignore it instead. And we're all sort of we all feel a little disrupted. Next slide, please. So this is the global military presence by the U.S. in 1955 since the 2000s. So this is simply to show that there was significant decline in that global military presence, and that the U.S. is down 1 million people under arms. So the U.S. also has fewer resources to allocate to those strategic to an increasingly global volatile world, and this is why it's expecting allies to do more. Next slide, please. And those people who think that somehow there's this massive pivot from Europe to Asia. Well, if you look at actually the size of sort of troops and the changes of troops, it's not actually all the difference. The delta is about 20,000 troops. So I think everybody needs to kind of keep calm and carry on here. And that pivot to Asia, if you look at the numbers, well predates Obama's American pivot. So if you look at the numbers, what people say to get a very different things. And here's the U.S. military presence between 1992 and 2023. And sort of you can see sort of the gradual shift of the forces sort of in Europe, and in particular, of course, since we're talking here about Eastern Europe. You can see the growing force posture, both in Poland and especially. Next slide, please. And this is sort of the last slide on this. I just want to, when the U.S. says we need to do more, if you look at the growth in U.S. federal debt as a result of sort of also recent budgetary decisions, it's very clear that the U.S. is not going to have the resources to continue to have 340 million Americans under security of 450 million Europeans against 120 million Russians. Next slide, please. When you think about this from an alliance perspective, George Washington, no entanglements, it's very unusual for the U.S. historically to get itself into an alliance like this. And of course, that's because the U.S. learned hard lessons in the first half of the 20th century, that in order to make sure that the Europeans don't fight their wars down to the last Canadian, you ultimately need to have an American presence in Europe and a permanent presence in that regard. And you also need to do likewise when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. Those people who think that somehow, NATO is simply a military alliance, I encourage you to read Bob Cohen and go back to the 1980s, the economies of alliances. And of course, one of the reasons that the U.S. is interested in NATO is because it's a very effective coordination mechanism, because you have 31 other countries around the table. And so it's a relatively efficient way to herd the kittens. If you think about the Indo-Pacific, the transaction costs are very high, precisely because you don't have this sort of multilateral structure. So there's to say, and Trump understands this very well. So I don't think Trump is walking away from this anytime soon. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific, there are two mission sets in the Indo-Pacific. There's an air mission set and there's a maritime mission set. There's no land mission set. So for the U.S. Army, Europe continues to be the mission set. So all the people who think that the Americans are somehow going to leave Europe, they might want to check their facts. Next slide, please. So we talk about strategic autonomy in Europe, and there's two interpretations of that. There's the French interpretation, and there's the actual intention of what CIDP had in mind. The French interpretation is that somehow Europe needs to become more autarkic in its own decision-making. Of course, the interpretation that the European Union has adopted, that was in line with CSDP, and that also in 2017, when the French again socialized a rather curious version of strategic autonomy, they got a rather harsh review from the then NATO ambassador to make sure that there's complementarity between NATO and the European Union. I think it's interesting to talk about Eastern Europe because I think it often kind of gets short shrift as sort of the poor cousin. And I always like to remind Canadians that actually Romania is much more important for Canada than Canada is to Romania. Because of course, Romania is a key member of the European Union. And when it comes to priorities in the European Union, Canada ranks about country 60. So we need medium-sized countries like Romania to partner with to serve our interests. We forget about the Black Sea, and it reminds us that there's a host of different flanks. Not just Russian flank, but also a southern flank, of course, that has both the North African and the Middle Eastern components. There's a Baltic challenge, and of course, the northern flank. And so countries such as Romania understand the diversity of flanks, I think, better. These countries tend to be also rather pragmatic. If you look like a country like Poland, it is the one country that seems to, rather than invest forward, everything that Poland is buying is kit that it can use here and now. This is why Poland is, for instance, procuring Korean kit. And if you think about the Weimar Triangle, Eastern Europe is essential. If you think about the traditional war and threat vectors, it passes from Paris through Berlin to Warsaw and over into sort of the Ukrainian and to the Russian sphere. So these are all critical to peace and stability and prosperity in Europe, because that's where the wars traditionally unfold. Within the European Union, of course, we now have a Commissioner for Defence and Space, and we now have, if you look at my service report, the European Parliament now has a defence committee that's chaired by a very talented Polish parliamentarian, Michael Serwa, that just this week tabled a very interesting report on partnerships that everybody should be reading, because the EU and the EU Parliament wants to talk to us. It just seems that nobody in town here seems to be on par with actually understanding who in Brussels actually wants to talk to us. Why do I say this? Because I spent half a year there, and I got the impression that we're not particularly good, especially at decoding the EU Parliament to our interlocutors are. Defence Readiness 2030, the European white paper on defence, that is on the one hand about internal market mechanisms and on the other hand on procurement. And I mention this because, of course, while we've put a little bit of money into defense, the real money in the European Union, about $150 billion as part of the Safe and Security Action for Europe program, $600 billion in loan guarantees for those countries who can't borrow at competitive rates. There's only 5 countries in the European Union with a 5-star, with a AAA credit rating. If Canada was a member of the European Union, it would be the 6th country with a AAA credit rating. It would also have the 3rd largest spending on the military, by the way. It would have the 8th largest military in the European Union. So Canada provides good value for the European Union in its efforts, and it provides some of the capabilities, especially on the physical side, that we can't muster on our own. We've already talked about the different flanks. The challenge, of course, doing this without the Americans is issues of efficiency and effectiveness. So there's a study from the Parliament Research Service of the European Parliament that just came out 2 months ago. For every soldier that the Americans withdraw, Europe needs to provide 2 soldiers in return because of the inefficiencies that are associated with the different national structures. And so it's not as simple as simply replacing soldier for soldier. So Canada backfills. We basically need 2 Canadians, for instance, for every American that we're trying to battle for. We have significant infrastructure challenges, in particular in Eastern Europe, that some of the 1.5% commitment and some of the EU funding is meant to remedy. The procurement structures are still very much nationally based procurement structures, as much as the European Union is trying to change that. We have significant interoperability challenges. If you looked at the drone capabilities announcement just in the last couple of days, one of the challenges is the ability to build a common radar visibility and identification picture because of the different technologies that are being used, and the different targeting systems means that unlike NORAD, we don't have an obvious way, for instance, that drones flying to Poland, how we might target them from Lithuania. So we're improving on this, and I think we'll see a lot of change on this in the next 12 months. There's a number of technologies that are being rolled out. And of course, we also don't have economies of scale, which Canada and the European countries pay 2 to 4 times as much for piece of equipment as the United States, because the United States can do it better, faster, and cheaper. So the United States will remain an integral partner until we somehow find a way to get ourselves onto these national procurement structure. Last slide. Yes, the challenge that Canada is facing, everybody should be reading Kate Osler's book, which anticipates exactly what Trump is going to do. The book was published in 2023. And it warns us that Canada is increasingly alone in the world because we haven't provided for our partners and allies for what they've been asking for, in particular for the last 10 years. Canada has 3 strategic relationships, of course, the defense of the continent and the Arctic, our relationship with Europe and the Indo-Pacific. We've long used Europe, and this is Brebner's argument, also to counterbalance against the vagaries of unilateralism in the United States. But of course, we've had significant amnesia in recent years at doing so. We have some mechanisms in place, but these are not being exhausted very well. The free trade agreement, PESCO, Canada is participating in 2 out of 83 projects. One of those 2 projects is every country that qualifies under PESCO is a participant. It's the military mobility project. So there's a lot more we can do. We have this security and defense partnership that the Prime Minister announced in June, but that seems to be, by and large, as I can tell for now, just smoke and mirrors with lots of ambitions. But as the market explains, we've had ambitions in terms of our 3rd option since 1971 when it comes to the European Union, and we don't seem to be very good at realizing it. There's ultimately 3 priorities. What do we need to buy? How are we going to buy it? And how are we going to pay for it? What we need to buy is listed in the NATO procurement priorities. In 2025, ones point out that we fall 50% short of those priorities, not just Canada, but allies by and large. The problem with buying it is the shelves are empty. The Prime Minister understands this. This is why we've shifted from a defense procurement agency to a defense investment agency, because we need to actually invest in the capabilities we want to procure. And how are we going to pay for this? Well, it's pretty obvious how we're going to pay for this. We're going to be exporting critical minerals and liquid natural gas to Europe, and we're going to use the revenue to pay for defense and other types of investments in Canada. We're going to get the European Union and Germany to underwrite the critical infrastructure and major project investments that we're looking to make. And my worry is that if we can't get our act together, providing the European Union only has 2 key partners if it wants to decouple from China on critical minerals. 2 democratic partners that are Canada and Australia. And so if we don't get our act together, we will be a country that will find itself, its political and economic sovereignty even more threatened, because you see the stunning silence from our European partners with regards to what's going on in the United States and the threats against us. And that is, in my view, entirely self-imposed because we haven't been a good and loyal ally. And the most important thing we can do is provide supply chain security and to provide energy resilience. When Europeans are paying 4 times as much for their energy as we do here, that makes Europe less competitive, makes Europe less innovative, makes Europe less productive, and it effectively amounts to a Canadian subsidy for Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine. Thank you.
I just want to say very quickly, for those of you who are online, we apologize for the technical difficulties, and our team is working on video and making sure the slide decks are visible. Our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Benjamin Zyla, University of Ottawa. Mr. Zyla is a professor at the University of Ottawa and a senior research fellow at the NATO Defense College's Research Division. His research focuses on international institutions and regimes, global governance, human security, and peace and conflict studies, with particular expertise in humanitarian interventions, peace operations, peace conflict, post-conflict reconstruction, and the challenges of failed and failing states. He's widely recognized for his contributions to understanding the intersection of development, security, and humanitarian policy, and is dedicated to mentoring the next generation of scholars in international relations. Professor Zyla, you argued that burden sharing commitments should be evaluated as an active process in relation to changing security environments, not just as static inputs like percent of GDP. With NATO facing a changing security environment with war in Ukraine on one side and the Trump administration on the other, what are the contextual factors that Canada and other NATO member states should be examining as they pledge to increase the defense spending?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much, Karina and Bob, for the introduction and the invitation. I do have a PowerPoint slide. It's just one slide. I don't need to rely on it, but there's sort of 4 points on.
I'm trying to pull it up. I deeply apologize.
So I will touch upon the burden sharing issue in a minute. I've written quite a bit on this, also in sort of Canada's role in this transatlantic burden sharing regime. I slightly sort of diverge from Christian's sort of take on things, but we can discuss this in the Q&A. I want to make sort of 4 points today. And I was asked to sort of, think about things more broadly, as opposed to just sort of specifically on burden sharing, but I'll touch upon the burden sharing as one of my first points. So I make 4 points. The first one is the question of how much is enough? How much is enough in terms of defense spending? The second one is there's a decline of the West, a decline of, and Krina has alluded to this in her introduction. There's a decline of what the meaning of the West actually is. My third point is that we shouldn't really get too pessimistic about this because there are some opportunities for Canada as a middle power. And last but not least, I think our generation, so when I sort of just look in the room or, in my classrooms, our generation is not really used to experiencing the conflict and war. And I will sort of dive into that a little bit deeper. So those are the 4 points, and I will dive into this. And Paul, please feel free to cut me off. I can go on forever, but we only have 10 minutes, and I will try to time myself as well. So the first point, how much is enough? We all know that NATO now spends 3.5% on defense and 1.5% on defense infrastructure. It's not really, so the Italians, for example, have built a bridge over to Sicily as part of the military infrastructure, and everybody's asking, really, is this a military investment? But so the grandest scheme of things, 3.5% and 1.5% spending on defense. But what that actually means, and certainly you can see this in Europe every single day, is that the Europeans are buying American technology. They're buying American weapons for Ukraine and to stockpile their own stocks, essentially. When you shift the perspective, and I'm jumping through a bunch of things, I'm happy to pick up on those in the question and answer period. When you actually look at the support that the transatlantic relationship or the transatlantic alliance provides to Ukraine, so I'm talking here about NATO and to the European Union on top of that, you actually do indeed see a U.S. free riding on the Europeans and not the other way around, as the Americans are always trying to make us believe. What is my point? I just want to share sort of 2-3 numbers with you, just to sort of set the scale of things. In 2024, according to NATO data, its military expenditure amounted to $1.5 trillion, which is about 55% of the global defense spending. 450 billion of that or so comes from Europe, the rest from mainly the United States, and a small chunk of it from Canada. In terms of the scale of things, just go to that first slide, that would be great. In 2024, compared to the year before, that's about a 9% increase. Actually, the next slide. That's about a 9% increase compared to 2023, and it's a 31% increase from 2015. So what is my point? The point really is that the amounts is not really the problem. We can discuss the validity of these defense investments, but the real question is, how much is enough? So what's the sky? What's the ceiling? Where is sort of the maximum of defense spending? And there's really 2 or 3 points that are related to that. The first one is, what is that money all spent for? And where do we actually save? So part of the problem for the Canadian armed forces, for example, is the D&D hasn't been able to spend the amounts of money that it was allocated for years. So D&D has been sitting on money that it wasn't able to spend for the past few years. And that is an important element here, because even if we give D&D more money, as the sort of new budget wants to do, and again, we can debate whether or not that is necessary or relevant. But the point is that what is D&D doing with that money? And more so, how is D&D or the government actually explaining to Canadians what it is investing for? So I think what's missing here is a grand story of why we need additional defense spending. Why we need additional defense spending And where do we cut? Because the money has to come from somewhere, and who has to pay for all this? So I think there's a grander political story that is missing. There's an explanation for Canadians that is missing, and that I do fear has the tendency to actually underline the or at least impact the Canadian social contract. So if you have people who are struggling to make ends meet, and then you see these huge amounts of investments in defense spending, you're gonna have to provide an explanation as to why you're investing so much in defense as opposed to in other programs. My second point: the West is in decline. It's a point relatively quickly told. I think we know from history that the history of transatlantic relations has always been a community of the West. We shared certain values, we shared certain principles. We shared the principles of democracy, freedom, the rule of law, market economies, human rights, etc., etc. But what we see is actually an erosion of democratic values and norms, and not only since the Trump administration re-entered the White House earlier this year. We saw and we continue to see threats of populism, authoritarianism. The point is, Western values are losing their meaning. The Transatlantic Alliance as a community of values and principles and norms is eroding, and that erosion occurs from the inside rather from the outside. So the threat really to transatlantic relation comes from the community itself rather than from outside. My third point is perhaps there are some opportunities for Canada in all this kind of scenario. We know that the history of Canadian foreign policy and certainly the literature on Canadian foreign policy has linked Canadian middle powermanship to sort of liberal internationalism. But the point is that liberal internationalism is dead, and it has been sort of dying for quite some time. But that in and of itself actually doesn't mean that liberal internationalism in and of itself is disappearing. There is opportunities, there's functions that are sort of intrinsical, that are important for Canada because they're essentially detached from liberal norms. So if we detach liberal internationalism and just focus on sort of the liberal norms, there is some opportunities for middle powers. And I will just sort of highlight three that at least come to mind. The one is sort of the mediation. So if you think about the practice of mediation, if you map middle powers sort of on a in a sort of in a typology, what they have been doing over the past, and if you think about sort of middle power practices, it's about mediation, it's about niche diplomacy, and it's about multilateralism. So we're really good at doing these things when it comes to mediation, to bridge, to build, to create relationships, to stabilize, to engage in negotiations, those kinds of things. When it comes to niche diplomacy, it's about sort of convening, it's about hosting, it's planning, it's advocating, it's about providing information, transparency, and some form of investment as well. And the last point, the practice of multilateralism is about coalition building, it's about partnering, it's about, yes, human security. And there's a huge literature on the ineffectiveness of human security, but there's also quite a bit of literature on the positive angle of what we were able to achieve with regards to human security. So I think the point that the main takeaway is that middle powers have certain sort of cutting edges, if you wish, if we focus on and strengthen their functions in an international world order. And last point, and I will stop there, Paul, if you give me like 2 more minutes, is our generation is not really used to war anymore. And why am I saying this? It kind of touches upon what Christian was saying about sort of defense investments. Certainly the threat of Russian sort of invasion or attacks in Canada is relatively low compared to what some European countries are going through at the moment. But we used to have, and this is the point, we used to have politicians after World War II who sort of have gone through or experienced a world war, and they have built European institutions to actually mitigate the threats of war, the dogs of war, which sort of contained through the project of European integration. They built European institutions, whether it's the Parliament, whether it's the Commission, whether it's the Council, the European Steel and Coal Community. So the process of European integration was, yes, a political elite process, but it was driven by trying to avoid future conflict, future wars. We're not close to that anymore because the generation that has experienced or has gone through those kinds of conflicts and war has essentially has disappeared. They have sort of died off. And so what we need as a new sort of generation is to think about ways to, and this sort of closes the circle to my very first point, is if we can actually explain to certainly the younger generation that these defense investments are needed, and that there is an economy of scale behind it, that everybody can, in one way or another, profit from this. If you think about, for example, creating jobs for auto workers in sort of the GTA area that are sort of laid off because of the tariffs imposed by the United States, who can sort of convince automakers to actually shift part of their manufacturing to defense procurement. Well, that is a first step towards overcoming the structural dependence on the United States. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Dr. Ann Fitzgerald. Dr. Fitzgerald is professor and the director of the Bosley School of International Affairs, where she leads interdisciplinary research and education on global governance, international relations, and public policy. Her work focuses on the intersection of diplomacy, development, and international security, and she has published widely on global governance, policy innovation, and international collaboration. Professor Fitzgerald, at a time when NATO's member states are reappraising their roles and contributions within the alliance, could you elaborate perhaps on how you see sort of the important challenges for collective security going forward in relation to geopolitical tensions?
Well, thanks very much for having me, and great to see so many people out, and of course, students in the audience. I'm not going to repeat a lot of the geopolitical trends that have been discussed already, but I just want to agree with Christian on one point that I think deserves some serious attention, which is that, yes, there's been an apparent pullback, and it's been described as such, of the US from Europe. This is a physical pullback, not an actual pullback, because with its focus on the Indo-Pacific region, with hard and soft capability, the Arctic and the Panama Canal, and arguably the Arctic region is the next new Panama Canal, the US is using a strategy of regulatory remote control as well. And this is why they're so concerned about the governance and regulatory frameworks concerning data and what I call the new general purpose technology and infrastructure that countries are now pivoting to. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the quest for economic supremacy and tech dominance is really having profound implications for how military strategies, particularly with the US and China, are unfolding. So implications for NATO. This is an alliance which for some members has a conflict on its doorstep, which without US support is exposed to a deficit of air defense and long-range precision weaponry. It is an alliance of members that are suffering from economic stresses at the moment, and yet being told that they have to increase their GDP spend on defense silently. And the only way that NATO countries and the middle power can do this is to ensure that defense expenditure supports economic prosperity agenda. So this has some interesting implications for collective security, which is what the NATO alliance is all about. So how do these national positions that are looking inwards, that are being protectionist, that are economically stressed, will have on collective security in a world which now has 5 important domains for military capability, not just 3, air, land, and sea. It's got cyber and space as well, and new important pillars of sovereignty, which threat vectors really impact, like psychological and cognitive sovereignty and data sovereignty, right? Data is the new oil. It's the most important business and organizational asset. It represents, as well as other intangible assets, over 90% of the value of the S&P 500. So we're seeing real strategic behavior along global value chains according to power dictated by who owns intellectual property patents and who controls data. So it's a profoundly different world, and also related to collective security is rules, right? Collective security depends and is underpinned by rules, doctrine, laws of armed conflict, laws of the sea, other international laws, multilateral agreements, standard operating procedures. But with this new general purpose technology that countries economically and militarily are pivoting to, there's a lack of laws. And that general purpose technology can be described as having 4 parts, right? Data, artificial intelligence, compute power, which will eventually be taken over by quantum power, and protective systems, right? Cyber systems. So you can envision a car, right? The driver is the intelligence, they're the AI. The fuel that goes into the car is the data, but you need metadata sets to make things trusted and experimented with. You know, and that has implications for Canada as well, because we have small national companies on the whole, small to medium-sized companies, and we haven't generated as much in metadata sets to feed trusted AI systems as we should be. The cybersecurity system protects the car. That's a shell on the outside, and then the engine is the compute power, and that's why you hear a lot of talk these days about sovereign compute, which we're grappling with, and of course, quantum is hitting us in the near future horizon. So the interesting implication on governance and rules surrounding this is that through no fault of their own, civil servants and governance experts lack the skill sets and knowledge to develop policy, legislation, and mediate in this environment. And it's been a real shock to the academic system. It's been a shock to the global governance system. And we need to pivot to a policy orientation that is fit for purpose for an intangibles world, rather than a tangible and analogic world. So tensions surrounding collective security and reimagining collective security, which will involve a degree of duplication because we're inward focused and protectionist at the moment, but should involve some specialist contributions depending on the NATO member. Tensions only also in ensuring that the 5% defense spend supports prosperity agenda as well as military capability and dual usage technology applications. What does this mean for Canada? So there's important decisions that have to be made based on legacy systems and the redeployment or modernization or the disbandment of these systems and the investment in dual usage. So the issue of compute power and data is very interesting as a Canadian contribution to the NATO alliance. We have a bold arc of compute power and data, and certainly quantum capability depends on cold temperatures to make it work. It also depends on access to water. So you could say that Canada is at a geographical strategic advantage and an advantage concerning our science and research capability, universities, research centers to lead in this area. And whether that's in the form of NATO agencies in the Arctic in the future that can store, process, and facilitate the retrieval of data from data farms, etc., may be an option. It may be a specialist contribution that we can make, especially empowered by our abundance of cheap and affordable energy. But Canada can also play a role in the rules of the game because of that forward-looking higher education system, as long as we keep that system strong. We are a trusted, safe pair of hands, particularly in times of turmoil, along with other partners like the UK. So we'll never have the extent of the general purpose technology infrastructures that US and China does, but we can have an important role in a voice about the safe and responsible use of these technologies. So lastly, I would say I agree with Christian entirely when he said we have to get our act together and we'll be selling LNG and oil, et cetera, to our European partners. But as important as those energy exports are, and unrefined raw materials, that will not make Canada prosperous. What will make Canada prosperous are value-added, more sophisticated products and services, which we can lock down IP on intellectual property, and we can reap passive income from others in the world that want these products, positioned strategically in the global value chain, and pay us those IP payments and royalty, etc. You know, for a long time, we've been exporting beef to South Korea. We've been importing South Korean high-tech garments, and it should arguably be the reverse of that. So we need the unrefined raw material exports to go to other markets, especially markets like South Korea and Japan that's producing chips, that are producing robotics, and they need the energy. But we also need to provide high value add goods on the global economy, or else our unrefined raw materials will continue to leave our borders, the talent will be sucked out with it, and other societies will add the value, not only making those societies more prosperous, but offering greater affordability to their people because they're offering consumer choice with the value-added products and services. And we have to make the defense agenda work for these ends. So I'll stop there. Happy to take questions later on.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to attempt to go to one of our online panelists now. One of the problems of putting social scientists in charge of technology is it doesn't always go according to plan. But hopefully we've got this ironed out. So I'd like to invite Dr. Leuprecht now to join us. Professor Ratti is Professor of History of International Relations at the University of Rome 3. Joining remotely for this event, his research and teaching focus is on post-World War II international history, including U.S.-European relations, NATO's evolution, European security and defense policies, and international relations theory. Professor Ratti, in 2023, wrote that Russia's war in Ukraine instilled a new sense of purpose into NATO at the same time that it presented the EU with a reality check concerning the future of Europe's security architecture and the EU's relationship with NATO. How do you see NATO's mission evolving along with changes in the transatlantic relationship today?
Well, good morning and thank you very much. I hope you can hear me correctly. I'm not sure if you can see me, but if I get a go ahead, I will begin my 10-minute presentation. Can you hear me correctly? Good. So,
Dr. Ratti, I think that you might be muted.
let me check this again.
Why is this not working for me?
Professor Ratti, you might be muted.
I shouldn't be muted. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
That's great. So I will begin. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks to the organizer for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here, although not physically, and unfortunately only online. And I'm happy to see many friends among presenters and the public. So I will look at the general evolution, let's say, of transatlantic relations in the context of the current systemic constellation of power and of the ongoing war in Europe. And I will try to do this slide by going on a number of simple points over these 10 minutes. First of all is the title of the conference, is NATO at a crossroad? Well, I would say certainly partly yes, but at the same time, I would be dubious whether this is a crossroad very different from those that NATO lived through in the past. This is certainly not the first time that the alliance has been at a crossroad in its history. Actually, NATO has been going through many crossroads in its more than 75 years of existence. We could think of the Suez Canal crisis in the 50s. We could think of the many challenges that were posed by the period of détente. Then there was the end of the Cold War, 9/11, the Iraqi crisis. So there have been a lot of crossroads in NATO. And what is unique now, I believe, is the current constellation of systemic constellation of power and power distribution. This is almost unprecedented, and I don't think NATO has ever faced that type of situation. However, many of the challenges that NATO is facing and many of the solutions that have been proposed to address them are not completely unprecedented. They're not completely new. So there is certainly some continuity, some rhyme with NATO's previous history. And let me start with some assessment of the situation, and let me start with some positive notes initially. Now, in February 2022, when actually I was at Carleton myself, and on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, NATO was regarded to be as a dormant, understrength, with inadequate military personnel, and half-empty alliance. Its arsenals were half-empty, and there was a concern for some, especially in the aftermath of its withdrawal from Afghanistan, the NATO had become either obsolete, just to quote somebody, or brain dead. Now, what has happened since then? NATO has certainly been provided a new lifeline after its troubled withdrawal from Afghanistan, and it certainly demonstrated, I want to say, its Lazarus-like character. So there's been another resurrection in NATO's history. And as some commentators have pointed out, actually, NATO has experienced more resurrections maybe than Dracula, like in its entire life. So these are certainly like good, positive notes. And my assessment is that this resurrection, so this revival, has been made possible by four major key dynamics that I would like to emphasize. First of all, there's been a renewal of American leadership, and this has occurred first and foremost through the Biden-Harris administration, but I would say to an extent also through the Trump-Vance administrations. Secondly, Europeans for the first time maybe have really begun now to walk the walk, in a sense, or to walk the talk. Trump has managed to obtain commitments to increase defense spending potentially up to 5% of GDP. Germany has announced unprecedented rearmament plans, approving at the end of March 2025 a historic bill which has amended the country's constitution and massively boosted defense spending. Certainly, this process will be slow, it may be difficult, but nevertheless, it represents a sea change in European security. The third element is that NATO has acquired two significant new members, Sweden and Finland, and this has allowed it to consolidate further its northern and eastern flanks. And the fourth element is that NATO has confirmed its character of a community of values, although within a certain diversity among its members. And with that has come also an ability to blend together countries with different domestic qualities or priorities, from Turkey to Hungary or Slovakia and so on. So diversity cohabits within NATO. And maybe there is a fifth positive note that is not directly related to NATO, because Ukraine is not a member of the alliance and may not be a member of the alliance in the near future. Ukraine has been able, despite increasing difficulties, to resist for 4 years and not to succumb to a much larger army, and to mobilize roughly 800,000 soldiers over this 4-year period. Now, let's come also to the other side of the coin, to the bad news. Not everything is so rosy as some commentators have argued. Now, my point of view is that this revival and NATO successes, they do not have to be exaggerated. And they are both systemic, infrasystemic, and also unit-level dynamics that may undermine NATO cohesion and effectiveness in future years. Let me begin from the systemic element. Well, I tend to be very close to the realist approach to international relations, and I believe the systemic factors play a major role in how states behave. We are currently going through a system that is certainly much closer to a multipolar one than a bipolar one or a unipolar one that we, for example, experienced either during the Cold War or right after the Cold War. And this certainly creates opportunities, I would argue, for deviant policy and defections, not only towards Russia or China, but also among mutual relations between NATO members. Furthermore, it is clear-cut, as it has been made clear by previous presenters, that the US primary focus is now on the Indo-Pacific, and this creates concerns about Washington's ability to maintain its commitments in both the North Atlantic and, as I said, Asia or the Indo-Pacific. So this is the systemic. Then let's move into the infrasystemic. So within NATO, I think here the main issue is the fact that the alliance continues to experience a disproportional contribution and a major asymmetry among the allies. And with that comes a situation of strategic dependence on the United States. That doesn't guarantee a real partnership between the two sides of the Atlantic, maybe not even between the United States and Canada, and doesn't guarantee to the European access to crucial technology, particularly in the nuclear field. And now let's move to the unit level. This is an aspect that certainly matters for some countries in Europe, but matters first and foremost, again, for the United States. The current administration apparent disdain of multilateral arrangements and enticement for unilateralism poses question about American commitment to NATO, whether the US can still be considered an indispensable nation. Now, certainly, the US commitment to European security and transatlantic relations from this side of the Atlantic, or this side of the pond, for some has looked increasingly shaky, especially after the second Trump administration came to power. This has rekindled European anxieties, has rekindled fears of abandonment that are the other side of the coin, certainly of American fears of entanglement in European politics. Nonetheless, I believe that Trump's return to the White House is not the primary reason of European anxieties. Maybe these anxieties can be traced back already to the pivot to Asia, announced more than 10 years ago by the Obama administration. And also, let's not forget that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is not automatic. It obliges member states to take action, but the action that member states retain or deem to be necessary, not necessarily to go to war. And also, let's not forget that Ukraine itself is not covered by Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So certainly recent dynamics have not fully undermined the notion of extended deterrence, which means there are certainly issues, there are certainly problems, but like NATO success, they don't have to be exaggerated. So where are we now? Well, I believe that empirical evidence has provided significant rebuttals to the ubiquitous declarations that the alliance was either dead or currently in its death throes. Catastrophic predictions have not come true and have not affected NATO in any significant way. Also, there has not been the slightest mention of the prospect of an American withdrawal from the alliance in NATO's planning. On the contrary, NATO adopted new operations and adapted to the new situation. These new operational plans were squarely aimed at defending against and responding to the specific threats posed by the current environment, including the remote possibility of an attack by Russia. This adaptation remains, however, a work in progress, including in terms of NATO's command, including NATO's force structure, readiness, posture, and even its very relationship with Moscow. Furthermore, for a number of reasons, and this has to do certainly with Indian political, domestic political dynamics, partly, the degree of policy change and adaptation remains somewhat uneven among member states. Some members, particularly NATO's frontline states, having instituted and implemented dramatic shifts and changes. Others instead, and maybe Italy, one of them, certainly, which have been slower in adapting their military posture. What is the future? What are the future prospects? To come close a little bit to a conclusion of this general assessment. Well, I would say that all in all, the outlook for the alliance remains positive. The European and Asian theaters systemically remain deeply interconnected, even if the United States may give priority, certainly in future years, to the Indo-Pacific. And this is even more so today, the case today, than it was, for example, during the Cold War, when, let's not forget, the war in Korea was one of the major factors that triggered was Germany's rearmament and membership of NATO in the 1950s. Even today, the United States cannot afford to disengage from Europe to focus on Asia. And certainly the United States never disengaged on Europe when it focused on Asia, for example, Korea, 50s, or Vietnam, roughly 15 years later. So 4 key points, 4 key concluding points I'd like to emphasize and these are potentially 4 policy recommendations. Well, certainly the transatlantic link and cooperation with Europe, they continue to represent still the best options available on the table for the United States and Canada. This is true both in terms of the shared values that we have, it's true in terms of military interoperability, it's true in terms of trade relations, technological development. So this is the cheaper option at the disposal of the United States. Second element is the role of Europe in the alliance. I think it has become clear that the Europeans need to walk the walk, as I said. So there is a need to strengthen further the European pillar. And this will not be like an easy walk. Certainly, European ambitions and American demands for Europeans to do more will inevitably collide with economic and financial constraints. And this may probably reinforce Germany's future role in European security. At the same time, war in Ukraine has made it clear that a Europe of defense or European strategic autonomy, if you want to use that term, will not be constructed, will not be possible by the European Union alone. The role of the United Kingdom, despite Brexit, despite its withdrawal from the Union, remains fundamental in terms of European security. So there is not going to be like a European security dimension in which Britain doesn't play a role, as some people, as some observers had called for in the aftermath of Brexit. Now, more problematic is the third point that I like to touch upon, and it's the future of extended deterrence. NATO allies and the allies rely on the deterrence provided by the American nuclear arsenal. Here there is a very complex interplay, I believe, between the war in Ukraine, the collapse of arms control, and the risk, and I think this is also a certainty, that we are moving towards a new phase of vertical and maybe potentially horizontal proliferation in terms of nuclear weapons. Now, this is certainly a long-term dynamic. This is not only linked to Ukraine, as one of my Italian colleagues has emphasized. Cracks in the international arms control regime had already emerged in the early 2000s. You certainly remember the American withdrawal from the ABM treaty in the early 2000s. But certainly, Ukraine has accelerated this dynamic, leading Moscow to suspend Russia's participation in the New START treaty, and then leading the Russians to pull out from the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, the CFE treaty. So there has been an erosion and for some, even a collapse of the arms control framework. And this may undermine the credibility of the American extended deterrence to the European allies, with significant implications for NATO. Why is this the case? Because this is the first time now, since the days basically of East-West detente in the 1970s, that the stability underwritten by verifiable arms control limits has been called into question. And this certainly will make the American commitment to the European allies probably less credible, but also less manageable in a sense. So for NATO, this translates into a new reality. The alliance must now plan to counter weapon systems and operational scenarios that were previously unthinkable. Russia is at the liberty during the war to develop, test, and ultimately use a wide array of new weapons with tangible consequences on the battlefield. Inevitably, the need for NATO to come to terms with this reality will certainly put the alliance in a condition to plan to counter weapon system operational scenarios that maybe were unthinkable before 2022, with a direct impact on strategic planning, resource allocation, combat effectiveness, and readiness. Now, there is certainly a risk that the United States may be tempted here to pursue a massive conventional and nuclear build-up in order to find a solution, maybe a Gordian knot solution to the
especially in Europe and Eurasia. You've been analyzing survey data and research that was commissioned by EETN in Armenia, Estonia, Georgia, and Latvia concerning security and threat perceptions. Actually, you have a presentation. You're going to walk us through some of the implications and findings.
Yeah, absolutely. If it was that slides.
Yes.
Just- Okay. So we talked about data and military sociology. So this presentation will be a little bit about that. Paul, thank you so much for introduction. And today I'll be talking about the results of national and public opinion polls that we conducted for Eastern Europe and Transatlantic network projects at Carleton. So basically, these are, I will walk you through the security perceptions of the residents of these 4 countries in the Baltics and the South Caucasus. So we interviewed about 1,000 respondents for each country, among adult population. We have nationwide coverage of this within this survey, except Georgia, for obvious reasons. This study was conducted, these surveys were conducted earlier this year through a combination of telephone, in-person, and web surveys in all local major languages. So, and without further ado, let's first look at how thank you. Can we go back quickly? Yeah, so this is great. So let's first look at what are the chief perceived security threats locally. So Russia and domestic political instability dominate across Estonia, Georgia, and Latvia. Armenia is a slightly different case because there is the possibility of renewed hostilities with Azerbaijan that comes out as the most important security threat, followed by, again, political instability. So I would like to mention that this study in Armenia was conducted before Armenia and Azerbaijan agreed to initiate peace deal this August. So perhaps the perceptions have changed after that. So going back to the rest of the 3 countries, in Estonia, the majority perceives Russia as the most important security threat. In Georgia, the public is split between Russia and those who say domestic political instability is the most important security issue. And what is interesting is that about 1/4 of Georgians say that they don't know what's the most important security threat. In Latvia, still Russia dominates, closely followed by political instability, and also 14% of Latvians said that it's war in Ukraine that is the most important security threat that the country faces. Considering this, it's not a surprise that Russia, the CSTO, and to a lesser extent China, considered as they have a net negative impact or having a net negative impact on local security. Here is Russia, the bottom of the league table. Interestingly, in Armenia, a country that is a member of collective security treaty organization, sort of NATO's, sort of Russia's answer to NATO, the majority of Armenians actually think that this organization has a negative security impact. On the other hand, NATO, European Union, Canada, and the United States are perceived to have positive impact on local security. European Union is perceived as such by the majority in all countries. NATO is also perceived, widely perceived as having a net positive security impact on local security, perhaps with the exception of Armenia, where the public is split between those who believe that the organization has a negative and positive security impact. Still, more people in Armenia think that NATO has positive impact. Canada is also widely perceived positively, especially in the Baltics. Also, we need to mention that, especially in the South Caucasus, many people think that Canada has no security impact or don't know or refuse to answer this question. United States is also seen generally positively. However, it is seen as such by the majority only in Georgia, by the 55% of Georgians. Interestingly, in the Baltics, more people think about Canada's security impact is positive than the security impact of the United States, which is quite an interesting finding, I think. So this is not a surprise that the majorities in the Baltics expect that the West will help if there is a military threat, if their country faces a military threat. However, we also need to understand that many respondents across these four countries think that they will be on their own if there is a military conflict. So Baltics and the South Caucasus diverge in this way, in this matter. Estonians and Latvians, the majorities in both countries, think that Western-led organizations, Western countries, or NATO would help if there is a military conflict. However, about slightly less than 1/3 in each of the countries think that they are on their own if there is a military threat. In the South Caucasus, the majorities believe that their countries are on their own if there is a military threat. People in Georgia are especially skeptical, with the majority saying that they are on their own. In Armenia, too, most think that they are on their own, or no one will help if there is a military conflict. However, interestingly, more people in Armenia think that the West will help them, and fewer people name Russia or CSTO as someone who will help in the case of military conflict, which is also an interesting thing from in a country that used to be Russia's security partner in the region. Many believe that being closer to NATO than Russia best serves the country's national security. However, uncertainty is quite widespread. In Latvia and Estonia, there is a consensus among the population that it's better to be with NATO. However, about 1/5, I would say, or from to a quarter of Estonians and Latvians either are unsure, or they say that it's better to be closer to both or neither, which is ambivalent answer, so to say. Georgians are split between who say that it's better to be closer to NATO and those who are ambivalent. Armenians are equally split between those who say Russia and who say NATO, which is yet again quite a kind of turn of cards compared to last year's. It is not surprised that NATO troops are considered and seen as to be enhancing local security against foreign threats, especially in the Baltics, where more than 2/3 of each country's population thinks that NATO troops make their countries more secure than less secure. People in the South Caucasus are divided. Still, more people think that they might make their countries more secure. And curiously, more Armenians think that NATO troops might make them more secure than Georgians, which is also quite a change, but not, fortunately, not a surprising change. So, considering that there is an overall positive assessment, can we go to the next slide? Sorry. Yeah, thank you. There is an overall positive perception of Western organizations. The majorities, the support of their respective countries' membership in the European Union and NATO is quite widespread. There is a major consensus across all four countries in terms of EU membership. When it comes to NATO, there is a consensus in Estonia, Georgia, and Latvia, where majorities support either remaining in NATO or being a member of NATO. Armenians are divided, but this is a very close divide. Still, more people will vote against NATO membership if there was a hypothetical membership tomorrow. Russian-led organizations, about which we asked only in the South Caucasus, are way less popular. Georgians would overwhelmingly vote against the membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. Armenians would vote, more Armenians would vote for the country's membership in this organization. However, the majority would vote against Russia's NATO, CSTO, against Armenia remaining in the CSTO, which also speaks a lot about the local perception. And finally, majorities in the South Caucasus express readiness to contribute to if there is a military conflict. However, in the Baltics, and I think this is very important, enthusiasm is way lower. More than 70% of Armenians say that they would do anything for war effort, including joining active duty military, reserve forces, territorial defense forces, contributing with physical work or financially. The majority of Georgians to say the same. However, combat roles are less popular than in Armenia. And the picture is totally different in the Baltics. About 1/3 in both Estonia and Latvia say that they would do nothing if there's a military threat. And joining the active duty military and joining the military reserve forces or territorial defense forces is way, way less popular than in Armenia and Georgia, about from 1/4 to less than 1/3. Non-combatant roles are a little bit more popular still compared to Armenia and Georgia. These numbers are quite low. However, we also need to keep in mind that these are just survey results and what people are kind of expressing, how they're kind of framing this. But what will happen if there's an actual military conflict, we don't really know. And there are very good examples from Ukraine and Poland in Ukraine prior to the Russian full-scale invasion, where one might have said that, okay, yeah, the Ukrainian society is not ready for this, but we see the opposite. So, to recap what we found out, Russian domestic politics dominate in terms of important local security issues. Russia and China are seen as net security detractors. NATO, the EU, Canada, and the United States are viewed positively. Public in NATO countries anticipates Western help, and many believe that being closer to NATO preserves national security. NATO presence on the ground is also viewed positively, and I think we should root for this and use it very actively. Support for EU and NATO membership is also widespread. And finally, something that we need to keep in mind is that readiness to contribute to national defense is high in the South Caucasus, however, more limited in the Baltics. Thank you again for this briefing event, and hopefully we will have some chance to discuss in some more detail.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sichinabo. Our last speaker will be online. Dr. Mihai Sev holds a PhD in political science from the University of Bucharest and is head of the European Affairs Department at the European Institute of Romania. He is joining us remotely. He coordinates the European Studies Unit and conducts research on European affairs, the history of the European idea, and the impact of new technologies on politics and society. Do we have questions over here? We get them on screen.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great.
There we go.
So, first of all, greetings from Bucharest, from a rather rainy city at this moment. So, I want just to have a short disclaimer that all the opinions expressed here are my own and do not involve my institutions or the University of Bucharest. So, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure being here with you on this very critical roundtable dedicated to NATO at the Crossroads. Why does it matter? It matters because we just had here in Bucharest the NATO Military Summit, where we discussed how the rearmament aspects, the development of the defense industry, can help better propel NATO into the future. So when we speak about NATO and the future, there are three main elements that, in my opinion, needs to be taken into consideration. First and foremost, we need to deliver on the 5% GDP commitment by 2035. Why do we need to deliver? Because it is more than a political commitment. It should be an economic investment, and we need to have, finally, let's say, an approach where our political actions, our political words are finally translating into real life activities. It's also about quantity and quality. In the last years, we realized that other than the sophisticated, let's say, weapon system, we need to be able to better produce or to restart producing some basic elements such as gunpowder, like was the case here in Romania. And just recently, NATO General Secretary stated here in Bucharest that we need to outgun, outproduce, and outsmart our adversaries, and this requires long-term commitment to the defense industry. It is also about the ability to produce a robust and credible forward defense posture, especially here in the eastern flank of NATO. And it is also about the need to go to have resilience and to go from periphery to center. It's about learning new issues such as the fact that cyber matters and energy security matters even more. And therefore, we need to get prepared against hybrid attacks and the geoeconomic coercion of third-party non-NATO states. It is also about military mobility, and I say that as I came from a country where highways and high-speed rails have been more or less a wishful dream in the last decades. It is just recently in the last couple of years that we have finally started to develop the much needed highways and bridges, for instance, over the Danube River, meant to ensure both military mobility and economic mobility. It is also about taking into consideration new risks such as health security or climate aspect. And for instance, Romania has developed its own strategy how to address climate change in armed forces. And last but not least, it's about going global. Although NATO core is Euro-Atlantic, our security is inextricably linked with global dynamics, especially what is happening in the Indo-Pacific area and also the southern flank stability. And I mean here Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans, where any complicated action may have a direct impact on our security. In that context, and I'm going to put now my hat of a Romanian citizen, we are going to speak more about what we should all realize, the importance of the Black Sea anchor for NATO and also for the entire world. Why do I say that? Because Romania is at a crossroad on the eastern flank, the Black Sea and the Danube Delta, and this critical strategic node requires some audacious investment and also grand-scale strategy. Romania has committed itself to invest more into NATO and to reach new targets of the GDP until 2030. And also, we've started to see the first fruits of our decades-long advocacy for the Black Sea Hub. We just had, for those of you who are interested, the EU strategy on the Black Sea this summer, and it presented the need to build in Constanța port, or in the Black Sea to be more precise, a new hub for the maritime aspects. And we hope to have it here in Constanța in Romania. It is also about developing enough territorial defense in order to discourage any potential conflict. And last but not least, when we speak about the Black Sea anchor, we need to think about regional cooperation and how to better use the existing regional cooperation from Central and Eastern Europe. And I mentioned here, for instance, the question of the Three Seas Initiative. This initiative, launched a decade ago or so, still has yet to reach its full potential. It comes up on a very good platform how to build connectivity from north to south, and there are some flagship projects like the Via Carpathia highway or the rail to sea that goes from Poland to Romania. Yet we need to do more. We need to be able to fully interconnect our region from the point of view of infrastructure, digital, and energy. This is also about using what we already have, the trilateral cooperation format where Romania is a part of and which can bring much more results. We already have a three-way cooperation format with Poland and Turkey, and this defense-focused cooperation may bring more coordination to a region where things are complicated already. Then we have the Bucharest 9 format, which I found it to be one of the most dynamic sub-regional format in NATO. It brings together the countries of NATO from Central and Eastern Europe, and it helps us to have a unified vision on what we want from the future and how we can help NATO. If the countries in the region are unable to coordinate themselves given the common challenges, then I'm rather skeptical that we can speak about a better future for NATO if we as neighboring countries in Central and Eastern Europe cannot speak on a single voice and say we need to do this and that. And also we need to put to good use our EU membership. The fact that Romania, like Bulgaria, Poland are both NATO and EU countries may help us to better use the existing resources. It's not necessarily about bringing in new financing, but it is also about better use of already existing financing. And the EU, for instance, here can play a key role when you speak about the need to invest more in infrastructure and how to better put to use the already existing EU programs. Romania is also interested in developing our strategic capacity building. It's about better using the new money allocated to rearmament and defense industry, and it is also about how to use the geographical anchoring that I mentioned before. This geographical anchoring may just be the software of deterrence, as we have the instance, the Mihail Kogalnicianu Air Base here, that may just become the Black Sea Super Hub, as the air base is going to expand more and more by 2030 to receive approximately 10,000 soldiers and their families. And Mihail Kogalnicianu may just become the major logistical hub in the region for both ally operation, and also, very importantly, it may serve as a strategic artery for the reconstruction of Ukraine, because we should focus not only on NATO and our infrastructure, but we should also focus on the neighborhood. And the question of reconstruction of Ukraine is something that is also linked with the security of our region. And amplifying the strengths of the regional formats is one way to advance NATO further and our stability. And I'm thinking often here about the need to spearhead more bold infrastructure projects, like the Danube corridor. The Danube River has been for decades an unused resource that lay dormant in our backyard. Danube River can help us better connect Central and Eastern Europe, can help us go further to the Rhine River and then to the Western Europe ports. And also it can bring together the goods from the Black Sea and further South Caucasus, Central Asia to Europe and to where these goods are needed. And Danube River may just become one of the best suited river artery for fast military mobility, for moving equipment from north to south. And also it might just become the key economic logistical corridor from this part of the world. We also have some problem and things are not very rosy in the region. We need to think also about how to better increase the cooperation in the region with Turkey as a dominant Black Sea military power that has the key to the Black Sea to the Montreux Convention. So working together better in the region, improving the infrastructure, and also realizing the fact that this is not something that we can do overnight, that we have bureaucracy to fight for, we have a defense history that needs to be rebuilt, and also that everything is also a whole of society approach. We cannot just rebuild without having popular support, and the political dimension of this common future is also of importance, and how to better talk with our citizens. So thank you very much for your attention, and our kind host announced me that I'm toward the end of my intervention. I'm looking forward for any comments and also the other speakers' intervention. Thank you, and greetings from Bucharest once more.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, Antonio Colabashano was unable to join us today. So we are now able to move to the question and answer portion of the panel. So the floor is now open for questions. For those of you who are listening online, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A portion of the event. And as you ask a question, please introduce yourself as well. And we have 8 microphones for all these members. So,
Hello, I am Trevor Peters, a second year MA student at URIS. And this is a question maybe directed towards Benjamin Zyla, but anyone on the panel can answer. I feel like alarmist. I do understand the necessity to develop a defensive industry in Canada, but I'm worried about unintended consequences in a time of democratic backsliding, about incorporating like a military industrial complex and how it may affect ethnic minority populations, increase surveillance, securitization, environmental concerns, and just like an over reliance, like with this economy of scale you're talking about, and like what civil society can do or public services policy can be able to prevent unintended consequences.
I'm the Polish ambassador. First, I would like to express our appreciation for the network, for the association for organizing this event. I'm very happy to hear that there is such a full of content conversation on the security topics. It's very much needed, and it's good that it's happening at the heart of Ottawa. My question is about a topic which was raised here, but I would be interested in picking your brains on that. Arms control. We are right now in the, we don't use that term, but it is you know, it's a military race. We are trying to reestablish our capabilities, but the topic of arms control is a topic that we should bear in mind somehow, but it's, you know, obviously it's getting more and more complicated. But I'm just wondering, what do you think about the future of arms control in the context that we are living in? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you to all the speakers. My question is, it came up in a few of the different talks, this question of interoperability. And how concretely this can work at this point of replacing one US military base to other native soldiers. There's different examples that were given. But how does NATO show this? Talk about this, but what are the main issues that dealt with to assist interoperability in the future, or immediate future? Thank you.
Thanks. I think probably we should give the panelists an opportunity to respond to these questions. Given the time limits, if we could ask you to keep your responses to 2 minutes. I'll start with Professor Leuprecht.
I always find these questions entertaining about the Canadian defense industry because I'm, you know, in our rule of law society, look, I'm not worried about what our government does. And I'm not worried about what our industry does. I'm worried about what the Russian, the Chinese governments and their industries are doing. And we are not postured robustly or successfully, I think, to counter the challenges that we're facing. And we already have significant lag effects to make up for. So I think let's, in my view, keep our eyes on sort of where the real threat to our way of life is. And it does not emanate from our government, our society, or even, I think, from our key strategic partners. That go through their own up and downs. The arms control question is really interesting. I have a different take on this. That in effect, what we see is an arms control regime unfolding in Ukraine, because if we think about what happened to Russia after its invasion of Afghanistan, that was ultimately the end of the Soviet Union on a whole, I should say, contributed significantly to the end of the Soviet Union, economic, social, and political. And so I think we want to play 10 years ahead or so how this conflict and what is currently transpiring is going to affect the internal dynamics within Russia. And I think the internal dynamics within Russia are completely unpredictable. So whatever arms regime we might sign up for, we might face a completely different Russia tomorrow. And there's multiple future scenarios. So I think arms control, that's what we want to posture ourselves, or we might want to posture ourselves for. The interoperability piece. So I think of this in terms of, if you think about it from a Canadian perspective, I think there are 3 very different conversations depending on which of the 3 kinetic environments you think about.
So for the Army, the interoperability is a European problem. For the Air Force, interoperability is primarily a North American problem and a North problem. And for the Navy, interoperability is an Indo-Pacific problem. So the way we think about interoperability is different than the way our European allies think. But if we, for instance, want more European allies in the maritime space, in the Indo-Pacific, we need to get our European allies to think differently about interoperability. And I always like to say, if you want to see interoperability of an emerging European military cooperation in action, look at our mission in Latvia. There's no other mission like it within NATO where Canada and Spain are taking the leadership at making different communications, targeting logistics chains, right? Everybody showed up with their own sort of stuff and figuring out how to make it work together. Now, I actually think we have it wrong the way we're doing it in Latvia, but I think it's an interesting laboratory because it's the one place where this is playing out in concrete as a concrete example. And the last piece on this, since we're talking about Eastern Europe and Romania, nobody's brought up the tailored forward presence, where of course Canada has made a long-standing important contribution, in particular through the Royal Canadian Air Force, in terms of helping to secure the airspace. And so Canada plays a key role across the entire Russian and Ukrainian frontier in helping people work together because Canada knows how to run multinational headquarters. And that's a very scarce skill and experience set that they need.
Thanks very much. Yeah, on the, I agree with Christian that there's a real threat to our way of life and prosperity at the moment. So a unified society, albeit a very diverse society, gives us strength. And it's been wonderful that we haven't faced huge threats as a Canadian society in the past. We certainly haven't felt that we have. So we've been able to cater for lots of different voices. But, if we're not sovereign, we won't have those groups and we won't have those voices. So at times of existential threats, we need to come together. I mean, I think what is very encouraging is this discussion that's emerging on east-west electrification of the country and how if we do that for prosperity purposes, the carbon count will lower naturally. So we can address environmental concerns by way of a prosperity agenda and other like-minded issues. On the issue of arms control, I do think it directly correlates with the technology race because the way wars are being fought increasingly, we saw that with the introduction of the MERIPS system. It's been written about over the last couple of weeks, the new drones that the new drone system that the US has developed to combat swarms of drones, which is a new way of fighting, right? Because they sneak around the agility and the mobility of large aerial capability. And the US capability is, it can combat anti-jamming capability that adversaries have started to develop on drones. So it's a technology race, right? It's spiral, innovation, illicit innovation, illicit, intervention, and so on and so forth. So I think really, and you see what's happened with the recent agreement between Chris Stahmer and President Trump with opening the economy to Microsoft, NVIDIA, Anthropic, and all these investments over there. It sounds great, and success is being measured based on jobs, but it's sucking the data out of the UK. And it's really using the UK, in my view, as a plug into Europe. And so compute power, data and access to data, and basically access to the natural factors of productivity like water, like cold temperatures, etc., is what we have to keep our eye on because that's the way wars are going to be fought. I don't think we'll have infantry battalions in the medium future. I think robotics are just so advanced these days, and already unmanned vehicles are going to evolve unmanned tanks and other unmanned systems, the sea babies, as well as the drones in the Ukraine-Russia conflict are really dominating at the moment. So I think that can correlate directly to the race for technology. And Ukraine is arguably providing a real experimental ground for all of these things to be tested and further evolved. And lastly, how we go about interoperability. I think the NATO doctrine process has some utility here. One pen holder, they go around, they create standards, and then they're further nuanced back in their national capitals. But this has to be built around the new technology capacity as well. So I think the doctrine process would be useful.
Great, thank you. I'd like to invite our online participants an opportunity to respond as well. So Professor Civic, I believe you want to respond specifically to the arms control question.
Yes, thank you so much. When I speak about arms control, I believe that we already, in my opinion, let the genie out of the bottle. It's about the question of the AI, and we cannot find original solution to that. And the only, in my personal opinion, as a political scientist, we need to have a global solution, because otherwise, if the US regulates the artificial intelligence in our own narrow way, if the United States or Canada do it on their own, yet other actors do not regulate the AI, we are going to have some complicated issues. And I believe that what's happening now in Ukraine is just a foresight of future wars. I mean, nobody in 2022 have think about drones, automated weapon systems, and something similar. So having this in mind, it just said that we need to bring back the United Nations and multilateralism in the question of arms control and try to find the global solutions and answer to this aspect. Otherwise, we'll just have our own small pieces of regulation that are going to look very strange in the big puzzle when we assemble it at the end of the day. So this is my 2 cents on the question of arms control. It's not individual or regional, but something should be done globally because it's a global problem, especially given the evolution of new technologies and AI.
Okay, thank you so much. I think the video is behind the audio.
Yeah.
Professor Ronti, would you like to respond very quickly to any of the 3 questions?
Well, I like to focus especially on the last one again, arms control, because that's the one I touch upon in my presentation. I think this is going to be a major issue for both the United States and NATO. And again, here things are much more complex. And I agree with what Dr. Saber said before me, like the genie is out of the bottle. We are in a system where arms control agreements have started to be eroded well before the war in Ukraine started. The Ukrainian war accelerated it. It became like fundamentally now an occasion, an opportunity for many, especially for the Russia, to test new weapon system. But the problem is that whereas arms control during the Cold War was conducted basically bilaterally between the United States and the Soviet Union, now the systemic scenario is much more complex, which means China must be brought in, like UK and French nuclear arsenal somehow will have to be reckoned with. And again, with an American commitment to Europe being shaky, well, some European nations, and I don't need to mention the specific one, may be tempted with nuclear latency like in the future, which means, well, this is going to be a major issue, certainly in terms of nuclear weapons. For Europe, also conventionally, is gonna matter. Let's not forget the CFE treaty has collapsed. And again, all the further technological developments from drones to artificial intelligence pose another number of questions. Hence, the solution must be multilateral. How that can be achieved instead, I believe is certainly not easy to detect now. Maybe the only positive note, and this I would conclude, is the fact that I think both the United States and Russia have a clear interest in pursuing at some point arms control. And I don't think any of them, not even Moscow, would be happy to leave China uncapped in terms of the possibility to develop its own weapon system. So he'll have to be seen, but he will require multilateral effort, and certainly not one that can be dealt with bilaterally, as was the case till the 1990s substantially.
Thank you very much. Professor Zyla.
Just very quickly on so the unintended consequence. I think my point was pretty much this. I think there's a disconnect between what Canadians are worried about at the moment, housing, healthcare, cost of living, all these kinds of things, and for right or wrong, and compare that to a significant increase in defense spending. And by the way, that's not just a Canadian issue. It's a problem for essentially all NATO member states. Essentially to explain of why and how you invest so much in defense and what you're actually doing with that money. So I think the transfer of explanation, the transfer of sort of knowledge of what you're doing is missing. And that risks to lose quite a bit of a population and sort of, endorsing of what you're doing, or at least sort of, carrying you forward, and sort of, it's that sort of disconnect within society that risks of actually splitting, Canadian society or societies in NATO even more as they already are. And again, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't invest into defense. I'm not arguing that at all. But what I'm saying is, I think we need to better explain why we need those investments, and how you're going to spend the money specifically, and how that actually benefits people on the ground. And to your point about interoperability, it's directly connected to that. So if we can actually make the argument that we as Canadians or as Europeans are buying more Canadian kit and sort of, upscale our defense productions, and therefore sort of get more bang out of the bucks for our Canadian defense dollars, I think that's a valid argument to make. But somebody has to make that argument, explain it to people that this is what's going on.
Thanks, Dr. Sichinov.
Thank you. I can truly comment about grant strategies, arms race, and so forth. However, one thing that I would like to highlight is that public opinion is important, and it seems that, especially in NATO countries, the most vulnerable NATO countries, NATO and the West in general is still perceived as someone who can ensure local security. And I think NATO and all parties involved should take a note about that. And secondly, it is also very important that there are substantial shares of population, both Estonia and Latvia, that are uncertain about things. And perhaps national governments and perhaps even NATO should take extra effort to reassure these populations that, yeah, they are there for them and they are going to protect them if there is any type of military threat. There are nuances who these unsure populations are. In the Baltics, it's mostly Russian speakers, and I think it's certainly they need to do. Local governments or NATO has to do more to reach out to these populations and make sure that they do not feel threatened or do not feel themselves as if they're starving to the mainstream society. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. That's all the time that we have, unfortunately, for this first panel. But please join me in thanking our speakers for sharing their expertise.
Hello everyone, welcome back. We should get started for the exercise. Thank you for coming back. So after a very engaging first panel, which provides with academic perspectives on today's topic, today we are moving into a policy practitioner point of view on NATO's challenges and future trajectories. So we don't have any online speaker, luckily this time. Everyone is in the room, so it might be smoother than the first panel from that perspective. And we have with us 4 experts that can provide a very different perspectives on this topic. And we'll start with with our guest, His Excellency Witold Zyla, Ambassador of Poland to Canada. He has extensive experience in diplomacy, international relations, and multilateral engagement, with a focus on strengthening bilateral regional partnerships. The ambassador has been instrumental in advancing Poland's foreign policy priorities, promoting security, economic cooperation, and cultural exchange on the global stage. I think Poland has been on the news quite a bit lately, from unfortunately not for the best situation. So we would ask the ambassador to address in these 10 minutes some topics of interest, such as how Poland's proximity to Ukraine has shaped its national security, and also what measures has Poland taken to strengthen its eastern border in response to Russian drone incursion, and some other questions if we have time for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Once again, thank you for organizing this event. I find it really important that there are good people in Ottawa right now that are not only engaged in the area of the relationship between the transatlantic relationship with Central Eastern Europe, but you're knowledgeable, you're interested, and you think about this relationship in the long term. This is absolutely essential, and I think there's a big change in this regard for because of what happened 3.5 years ago, namely the brutal, illegal Russian aggression on Ukraine. So that led to the moment that we're in right now. When I came here nearly 4 years ago, there was much less interest in our region. Actually, they were in that time, some of the Canadian embassies reopened or opened in our region, which is to the benefit. And not so many experts which were that much engaged, and there was not that much reason to be engaged. There was a particular guy that is here down there. He doesn't have much hair, but the Balkan Denlin, who was genuinely interested in the region, and we found that he's weird in that way. But appreciated him a lot because he was the person that was going to the region, that was present at the conferences. He understood, and he was talking about the topics, including the 3Cs initiative, which was mentioned here, called the Bucharest 9. So different formats which were not that much recognized in Canada at that time, but they are well recognized today. So it's been a change. So despite the horrid reasons for the betterment of the quality of the relationship that we have, I have to say that I appreciate the fact that we see each other much better, and this relates to Poland as well, because from the Polish perspective, it's much was about the United States. Obviously, it was also Canada is we have to work with Canadian closer. But first, let's go to the US, and then on the way back we'll jump in. And then on the way back, always something happened. So today we are in a different situation, both from the Polish perspective, Canadian perspective. We have a serious strategic relationship, which is continuously growing. We just had Prime Minister Carleton in Poland with the announcement of the strategic concept of our relationship. So that's important. But to your question, I'll try to be slow because I'll try to be short in what I'm saying. That'll be the moment the time is here. As you know, Poland has been heavily engaged in the security of our region with the Russian full-scale aggression in 2022. Both us, but also our regional partners, especially the Baltic countries at the beginning, UK, Canada, US at that time, we got heavily engaged in providing political and practical support to Ukrainians. In the first year, Poland has provided over 260 tanks. Altogether, it was nearly 350, 600 armored vehicles, a lot of heavy equipment, and we were leading also aircraft and helicopters. We were leading the charge in the sense of promoting the idea of providing real support to Ukrainians. It was complicated at the beginning, but the Western world slowly, too slowly, turned around and understood that this support is necessary. Today we are in a different situation. Poland doesn't need to explain to anybody that there is a strategic importance in providing support to Ukraine. This is obvious in this conversation. Nobody that we had here before, nobody's questioning it. So it's a positive. It's a very positive thing. Our task right now is to continue that process and to see the outcome that could be considered by Ukrainians positive outcome, which is very complicated at this point. In terms of the security of the eastern flank, Poland in particular, there are ongoing processes in terms of strengthening our capabilities. As you may know, Poland has been for quite some time a lead in NATO, among the NATO countries in terms of military spending. This year we've been at 4.7% of our GDP. Next year we'll be at 5 or even higher. So we are number one country in NATO, and we've been working on our procurement in a quite successful way. We've been purchasing tanks, aircraft, howitzers, developing our own capabilities because we see that this is necessary. It is. I mean, it is about security of our region and my country, from my perspective in particular. But it's also about the idea of observing what we have. Poland entered the transatlantic community or regained its independence after many decades of being occupied, oppressed, our citizens killed, murdered, censored, and but after a number of decades, we re-entered the democratic world that we belonged to always. And since that time, we entered it with the belief that we're entering freedom of values of democracy, but also it's a community which is able to preserve those values. And so from the Polish perspective, it's absolutely essential to preserve the strength of NATO, strength of our community, because with the changes that are taking place in the world and we all observe them, this is the only way we can preserve our life. So what I've been doing here and what my colleagues all over the world are doing in the allied world, so to speak, we continue to preach and encourage our partners to build that spending and expand the reasons for that spending. It's not about security only, but it's also about money, and money makes the world go round. If we are weak, our economies will have its problems. It's unfortunately, power transcends to many other areas of life. It's a brutal thing to say, but that's the way it is. So first of all, we need to preserve our security and make sure that NATO remains the most powerful alliance in the world, and only then we can continue our development. I'll stop here. I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, so we continue with Mr. Eric Laporte, who is the Executive Director of the Defense and Security Relations Division at Global Affairs, where he oversees Canada's defense and security engagements with international partners. He brings extensive experience in strategic policy development, defense diplomacy, and multilateral cooperation, supporting initiatives that strengthen national and allied security. Of course, among some of the questions that you are thinking to address in your opening remarks, I'm wondering whether you can speak more largely about the overall global affairs strategy regarding military engagement and how Canada has worked to strengthen its partnerships amid shifting geopolitical alliances.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Hardak Ambassador. It's a pleasure to speak today. I think the title of this conversation today, NATO to Crossroads, Present Challenges and Future Trajectories, is really apt for the situation that we're in. Obviously, we are in an era where we're seeing shifting tides in global geopolitics, rising security threats, and sometimes a debate over the future of the alliance direction as a whole. From a global affairs perspective, I think it's important to look at where we are from a geopolitical context at the moment. We are returning to kind of the historical norms of geopolitics, which is kind of renewed great power rivalry and competition. And we're seeing, frankly, a growing risk of a real major conflict happening, or either spilling over or happening elsewhere. And so we have sort of blocks that are working on zero-sum competition. There's some competition within blocks on how to operate and how to see the future. But our adversaries are really sort of taking this in stride and sort of pushing the boundaries. They are intensifying their cooperation amongst themselves. They're expanding their reach and room to maneuver. And you just have to look at sort of the war in Ukraine, for example, where Russia has sought support from Iran and DPRK, but also closer to home, we see sort of greater Russia-China cooperation, including in the Arctic, where we've had Coast Guard, Russian and Chinese joint Coast Guard staff, but also long-range bomb flights close to the Aleutian Islands, requiring NORAD to respond. Some of these are also waging hybrid campaigns, sabotage, espionage, corrupting influence, etc., all with a view to changing the dynamic of the status quo in their region, but also destabilizing allies or even sort of trying to weaken Canada. So in that context, we really need a renewed focus on deterrence. And that requires obviously some reinvestment in defense capabilities and deterrence capabilities, and including offensive capabilities, because frankly there is no real substitute for hard power. I was part of the conversation in the first section where I think we're talking about autonomous drones and vehicles. Yes, we might not have a full infantry battalion, but we're going to have hard power being delivered through other means. And we just have to look at how that is happening, like the battle space in Ukraine. So again, no substitute for hard power, so that requires us to build up our defense industrial base, expanding our military capabilities, and strengthening our security partnerships. And frankly, this is where NATO comes in. You've got an alliance of 32 very capable, highly motivated countries that have the sole purpose to defend each other. And in a Paul Mill situation where they drive interoperability and cooperation and collaboration. And yes, there are rough patches. Sometimes there are disagreements on things, but NATO has had to move those throughout its history and still has survived and still has the strongest alliance that the world has ever seen and remains united. Myself, having worked on NATO issues for the greater part of my career, I'm always amazed at how adaptable and flexible the alliance is as it moves forward. You look at the Cold War, which was sort of very hard deterrence, but moving to the Balkans wars, NATO's first area out-of-area operations, Article 5 declaration in 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, and now a return to deterrence, but a change deterrence, not the same deterrence that we're talking about the Cold War. NATO has continuously transformed and adapted, and I'm confident it will continue to do that. And we just have to look at over the past 3 years, some of the things that have changed. Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. Two very capable allies with lots of experience in dealing and managing Russia, lots of experience in operating in the Arctic. So from a Canadian perspective, those are allies that we work with and very closely. NATO itself has sort of moved to add space and cyber as operational domains alongside air and maritime space. This summer, new defense spending targets, 5% GDP, that is huge. But that is a reflection of the threats that are out there. Sort of more micro changes to reflect the dynamic and changing security environment. We moved from EFPs, enhanced forward presence, to in the Baltic states and Poland, to a forward land force across the eastern flank, again bolstering the defense of the alliance. And Canada, of course, is leading the battle group from here, a multinational battle group. Two other sort of important things to look at, maybe from a Canadian perspective, in terms of how NATO is changing and adapting. One is the establishment of a climate change center of security, climate change and security center of excellence based in Montreal, which Canada is hosting, which is really looking at how allies and partners can adapt to the implications of climate change from their security and mitigate their own impact of climate change, but also strengthen the operational effectiveness. The other one is Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which is established to accelerate, dual-use innovation to try and ensure that NATO maintains the technological edge or regains it where it has lost it by sort of fostering thinking and innovation on the part of the companies. And here, Canada also is playing a part where we have the North American office based in Halifax. Maybe just to round out, again, how we're seeing NATO priorities evolve and kind of where Canada fits in. Just look at the latest NATO Defense Ministers meeting in October. Some of the priorities the Secretary General was talking about there was talking about enhancing deterrence and defense, keeping momentum on defense spending, ramping up defense industrial production, and supporting Ukraine. On enhancing the defense and deterrence, we saw it following the drone incursion of Poland, but also other Eastern allies, the launch of Eastern Sentry to support Baltic Sentry for NATO operations to monitor airspace. And again, as I mentioned, our contribution to the Eastern flank is the forward land force in Latvia, which is a tangible demonstration of our commitment and one that the Prime Minister recently renewed for 3 years. On momentum for defense spending, 5% by 2025, 2035 story. We just have to look at the budget that came out this week. A real commitment, continued commitment on the part of the government to hit 2% this fiscal year, but including through $81 billion over 5 years towards the 5%. Ramping up defense industrial production. We see obviously our European allies are kind of ahead there, but there are a number of measures again that the government has taken, including the launching of the Defense Investment Agency to sort of streamline and expedite procurement. Our friends at National Defense are working on a defense industrial strategy. Civil Affairs Canada has a defense export strategy, and so all of that is going in support of building those capabilities. Turning to Ukraine. Obviously, recognition that Ukraine's security is closely linked to that of the allied security, and we're all looking forward to ensure an outcome that is supportive of Ukraine interests. And NATO plays a role in that, and Canada also plays a role in that. So we're actively participating in the coalition of the willing, for example, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe I'll stop there, but just want to say again, expressing my confidence that the alliance has gone through a lot of challenges in the past, and I'm confident that it will continue to evolve and adapt to meet those challenges in the future. Thank you.
Dr. Carleton University. Is the director of NATO and Europe within the ADM of Canada Department of National Defense. In her role, she oversees Canada's engagement with NATO and European allies, providing strategy guidance on defense policy, international security, and transatlantic relations. She has extensive experience in defense and diplomacy and policy development, contributing to Canada's efforts to strengthen alliances and address evolving security challenges. Dr. Nakival, again, in your opening remarks, I'm wondering whether you can outline some of the NATO challenges that you see from Canada's perspective, but also if you can talk about the policy alignment within Canada between PND, Canadian Armed Forces, and NATO.
Thank you. I'm going to start by saying thank you to the Eastern European Transatlantic Network that the Department of Defense is very pleased to be able to support in its research and networking, particularly across the Atlantic and with Eastern European scholars and researchers to bring insights back to the Department of National Defense and Global Affairs. It's really invaluable to have that perspective, to have that challenge function, to have that sort of nucleus of creativity and new ideas. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here and the discussion we've had already. So with respect to policy alignment, I hope that first of all, I'm going to kind of demonstrate by example that my optimism is well placed in the sense that I think you're going to find my remarks really the natural part to Eric's remarks. Global Affairs Canada and the Department of National Defense are incredibly aligned. Not that we've ever been unaligned, but we're increasingly like-minded because we're seeing the same world, we're seeing the same realities, we're meeting the same challenges, and we're working together. And so I'll offer just kind of a layer down as instructed. I'm a Defense Department employee. I know how to follow orders to talk about policy alignment, and then we'll talk a little bit about NATO's challenges. So in terms of policy alignment, I mean, I don't know that we've seen it, certainly not in the recent past, as high a degree of Canadian policy alignment with NATO, but the alliance overall policy. You know, the degree of alignment today is higher than it's been in any time in the recent past. NATO is and always has been a cornerstone of Canada's international security policy. But these days, the bureaucratic processes that drive NATO have become more and more deeply embedded in Canada's own national policy process. And I think that hopefully that's obvious and the rationale is understandable to Canadians. Canada steadfastly supports NATO's principle of collective defense and is providing direct support to NATO missions, including through our deployment to Latvia under the Operation Deterrence, already mentioned by Eric. But also the smaller missions from NATO mission Iraq and our deployment to PISA support in Kosovo, as well as to different NATO formations, including NATO security assistance training Ukraine effort. In a complementary fashion, our support to Ukraine is enduring, and we're increasingly, I think, towards the front of allied thinking about coalition of willing, how we can support sustainable and favorable outcomes in the current conflict, and how we can continue to provide military assistance as Ukraine moves to that outcome, which we see as very much complementing our commitment to the alliance and its security, its territorial security itself. In terms of policy alignment, I mean, the processes are really what drives it. And it's not a really sexy answer to the question that becomes the degree of policy alignment, but it is just empirically true. Canada aligns itself with NATO allies through very deeply integrated and regularized processes that aren't replicated in any other international organization in Canada's alignment. We do this through regular defense minister meetings 2 times a year, where we reinforce our collective commitment to defense and deterrence. But we also do it in much deeper policy processes like the NATO Defense Policy and Planning Process, or NDPP, which allows NATO allies to not only align their policy goals, but also to develop a policy path forward, leading towards capability development, procurement, and eventually to be able to fight together to a shared outcome in the theater of operations. We, of course, also participate in the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting twice a year, and there are other ADM level meetings that happen 2 or 3 times a year, including for materiel, for policy, for personnel, for almost all of the different aspects of what makes militaries work. We're meeting regularly at the Committee of 32 to talk about how we can coordinate our approach to our shared challenges. I know that this sometimes is underappreciated in the academic literature, but I can't emphasize enough how useful it is for our deep familiarity with one another as allies in multiple different channels across almost all the functional areas of defense and military planning, and how this has an outcome that eventually becomes very strategically powerful. So why this deep policy coordination? I mean, I think Canada's embeddedness in NATO speaks to the strategic importance to not just the alliance, but to Canada itself. And it happens to, in this moment, resonate very well with the Prime Minister's own national conversation we started here in Canada. So the Prime Minister talks often, for example, about the need to move, which I think he sees as being intimately connected to our alliances. He talks about the need to rearm, rebuild, and reinvest in the Canadian armed forces, as well as to diversify our partnerships, particularly, but not only in Europe. The spending commitment that we're moving into, which is quite extraordinary, is part of that commitment, or part of that national conversation, but it's not the only element. The Prime Minister has talked about, and I know within the Government of Canada, we often acknowledge the quite heavy responsibility that we have to make sure that our increased level of spending is done responsibly and in a way that keeps the faith with the Canadian public and for the maximum benefit to all Canadians to our security broadly defined. So we're happy to have more discussion about that. But it's not just about GDP. It's about, again, a strategic outcome that we agree is best achieved through our alliances, through deep coordination, and through the delivery of outcomes to the benefit of our security. Okay, very quickly, to talk about challenges. Well, I think the most important challenge that we need to keep front and center is the challenge of a resurgent Russia that has proved itself willing and able to inflict damage against its neighbors, potentially including eventually NATO territory. And not just the threat of Russia alone, but the threat, as Eric mentioned, of Russia in partnership with other capable states who wish us harm. So even as we work through some of the other challenges, it's important to keep that overarching challenge in mind. Following naturally from that, our most immediate challenge is really time, space, and capability. Like Eric, I'm optimistic about NATO's ability to adapt. The alliance has proven over and over, I think, at least once a decade, that it can get through crisis and reinvent itself. We have no reason not to believe it can't do so again. But time and space is not our friend here. It's the most scarce resource as we go through this process together. We're going to need to uplift our capabilities, but not just uplift our national capabilities, but do that in a way that deepens rather than contradicts our interoperability. We're going to need to fight together if this is going to be a strategic competition that we win, which certainly is our intention. Another one of our challenges that's something I think a lot about, my military colleagues think a lot about, is the need to develop and build capabilities quickly, at scale, and at an efficient cost, which is closely tied to the challenge of innovation. We see the pace of innovation on the battlefield in Ukraine. I don't think it's realistic to think that in Canada we're going to replicate that pace. The pressures just aren't as acute. But we are going to need to greatly accelerate our ability to innovate solutions and get them into the hands of operators as quickly as possible. And then last, and this is a challenge that we talk about a lot in Canada, but I've come to learn that it's one that's shared broadly across the Alliance, which is the challenge of available personnel. So in Canada, we call it reconstitution. We know that in recent decades, the Canadian Armed Forces has not been as successful in the 2000s as it was in the 70s and 80s at maintaining its full strength. We've recently notched a lot of successes as it comes to recruitment and retention, but we're still not where we want to be. And so the ability to bring online not just people, but something we think a lot about. And we also are starting to think about mobilization. And that's mostly out of the conversation related to resilience at NATO. Resilience is going to require more than just a capable and well-equipped Canadian Armed Forces. It's also going to require broad public participation in the defense of our way of life. And there are many ways to participate in that. The term that we're using at defense to describe it is mobilization, but we're still just in the very, very beginning phases of understanding what that might mean in a Canadianized context. That's the fundamental challenges. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'll look forward to the discussion after the session.
We'll continue with our last speaker of the panel, Brigadier General Scott McKenzie, who recently concluded a distinguished career as Director General at Canadian Joint Operations Command. Over more than 3 decades of service, he led support operation at every level, from commanding one service battalion to overseeing national logistics for deployments in Bosnia and Afghanistan. And in your introductory remarks, as we discussed by Mayor, I would like to address, if possible, 2 questions. How is Canada adapting to joint operations to meet NATO call for readiness? And what are the key challenges Canada faces in scaling its defense industrial capacity to align with NATO expectations?
Thank you very much. And I think it's, good afternoon. It's very, very close to it. First, I would like to thank the Eastern Europe and Transatlantic Network, and along with the NATO Association of Canada, for the invitation for me to participate today. I find these discussions both exceptionally informative and very useful, particularly to help Canadians be better informed on some of the things we're talking about. I also want to thank all my fellow panelists and the presenters that we heard earlier. A lot of really interesting points came up, some of which I will try to I'll make sure my points are try to complementary without maybe going over exactly the same thing. And before I get into this a little bit, just a bit of context about where my perspective comes from. It's long, it seemed like it went fast, but it's a pretty long career. I retired about 2 months ago. So up front, my comments, perspectives, and thoughts are mine alone. They're not representative of CAP D&D. So that means I can step just maybe a little bit outside the lanes. But I'll give you my honest honest thoughts on a number of these things. I'm going to try to give a bit of a perspective of the military practitioner. That's at the bottom, of a lot of the policy discussions. And I think finally, before I get into this, during my career, I also had the privilege, or whatever other word you want to use for it, to work within our procurement organization within defense as a trained engineer. So I'll throw a little bit of defense industry stuff at the end as well. I'm going to try to hit quickly some points. What is Canada doing and how is that evolving? How does that support what I believe is the big military problem that NATO is facing? And I'll try to convince you that it's not something people in uniform can solve alone. And then a little bit of thoughts for Canada. I'll try and do it. So first off, what is Canada doing to support NATO readiness and operations, and how is that evolving? So there's a couple of things we're doing, some obvious, some less so. The most obvious one, obviously, is our presence in Latvia, where we're both the framework nation for all nations operating in Latvia, but also the lead nation for the multinational brigade headquarters. And that's been an evolution from when we originally had the battle group. There's some really interesting aspects to that. So going from a small battle group to a brigade, we've added aviation aspects. So for the first time in a long time, we've had both aviation and land forces in a deployed organization. We've also integrated, for the first time ever, a Swedish unit. So this will be the first Swedish battalion integrated in that brigade. That's the first time Sweden has deployed on in a NATO capacity, a formed unit. And they will rotate with the Danes. And like has been pointed out, we're learning a ton through that effort. It's not all rainbows and unicorns, folks. There's a lot of friction. And we're learning a lot of lessons. And we are considering it almost like a battle land. And for those who may have seen the news recently, this brigade is now going through its final check and validation exercise. We've flown an additional light infantry battalion over there to take part of that exercise, and part of the validation for NATO. So how is that evolving and how is that different? And there's a little bit of a Canadian context on there. So because it's growing, one thing that we've done is we've dramatically increased what we pre-position both equipment and people. And we are taking an approach whereby, in some cases, it's what I would call a fitted for, not with brigade, where all the pieces are there, with the exception of the people. And the people are flown in for the exercise, but also when the threat warrants an increase in strength. And we need to do that because Canada is relatively unique in NATO in that we're on the other side of an ocean. We're the only other one that's on the other side of a big ocean, and we don't have a lot of the capabilities of our larger friends there. So that's in Latvia. We also continue to participate and advertise our participation, which is probably the biggest change, in a number of other collective deterrence exercises in the maritime, aviation, and cyber environments. So we're getting together with our NATO allies and demonstrating our ability to work together, at least at one time. Another thing we're doing is we have always done this, but we're trying to do it in a smarter way, assigning key leaders, key planners throughout the NATO command structure. And we are in the process of reevaluating and reorienting to make sure that our people are in the right headquarters in what we call the chain of influence. And you'll sometimes see in a military parlance called the kill chain, which is really the decision-making chain from Brussels down to where Canadian soldiers are at the front line opposing Russia. And we're also, and nobody ever sees this, but it's really important and is massively growing. We participate in a whole bunch of planning efforts, rehearsal of concept drills, tactical exercises, and other efforts that are all designed to try to help NATO get after the big military problem we're going to talk about. Examples of that, I was, as recently as June, was in the Netherlands at Brunsum going through a rehearsal concept drill where we basically exercised the plan by which we would counter a Russian incursion into the Baltic, for example. And also in May, I spent time in Sweden talking about repositioning of materials, port stocks, and also talking about how we would flow people, equipment, and resources into a potential battle space through Sweden, through the Nordics, and through Central Europe. Those are all massively complex and important discussions, which I'll explain to you in a second. And then finally, I think, although it's not NATO specific, I think it's important to know that Canada has been supporting our Ukrainian partners from the get-go. We've been training them since 2015, and we've only continued that training, both specialist and general training. And we're very involved in a lot of the headquarters effort, the cooperative effort to plan how we're going to train, build, and equip Ukrainians, help them counter the Russian incursion. So all of those efforts are constantly evolving. I think it's important to know, so the pace of things that are happening in NATO. NATO has maybe historically had a bit of a reputation as being a little bit of a sleepy, slow-moving kind of bureaucratic thing. And to be honest, that's probably pretty warranted. But certainly since 2022, there has been a noticeable material change at the focus of the alliance, the focus of the military headquarters, and the pace at which they're trying to move things forward. And in fact, in many ways, it's a pace that we here in Canada struggle to keep up with because of, I don't know, the personal resources. All of these efforts are, in my mind, they're building blocks towards what is the fundamental military problem, which is ensuring that we have a demonstrable capacity to conduct integrated allied combat operations in the face of Russian aggression and to do it in a sustained manner over duration, right? In other words, to have a demonstrable capacity to fight a war against Russia. And I say demonstrable deliberately because the means by which you deter Russia and convince them that this is a bad idea is to demonstrate the costs in military terms what an invasion against NATO would bring. So why is that such a big military problem? Now, we've demonstrated through many exercises that we're very good operating over short durations, defined exercises in defined ways. But to take that from what we're doing today to become a demonstrable capacity to fight a war with Russia, there's a whole bunch of things. We need to unlock and figure out the problem of how we move and consolidate forces from multiple nations to the battlefront. That sounds easy, but that's going to need a whole bunch of things, everything from unlocking ports, which for the most part are not under government control in most countries, airports, rail networks, road networks, managing customs issues, which still exist internal to the EU folks, all sorts of issues interprovincially in Canada, and limited available shipping. There aren't merchant navies out there anymore to suddenly grab and move large amounts of material. So those are one problem. Integrating those forces from tactic to strategic level with pan-domain command and control, shared situational awareness, intelligence, targeting. There's always, I think, been a little bit of an assumption that the Americans would bring their system so we'd all learn how to use it. And that's not a realistic, it's not a realistic approach anymore. Nor is we're just going to bolt everybody's systems together because they're all close enough. And there's a lot of policy implications there as well, especially when you get into sharing of intelligence in real time data between countries, some of which are part of Five Eyes, some of which aren't, and all have different views on what can and can't be shared. We need to be able to sustain operations. And there were some allusions to it before it that NATO's very much been hey, sustaining logistics is the national responsibility. I'm here to tell you folks, we can't fight over 32 different supply chains. It's not going to work. And so there's a requirement to figure out how we can do collectively the logistics that can be done on critical combat supplies, whether it's ammunition, fuel, water, the normal. But then how do we integrate spares? We've learned a whole bunch of lessons. One sort of simple example from Ukraine, we all started donating artillery ammunition because Ukraine needs tons of it. 155 millimeter ammunition for those who are for those sort of things was the common one because it's kind of the common NATO standard. So we had about 15 different nations, and the idea for common NATO standard munitions is that you could take a 155 millimeter round from any country, put it in a gun and fire. Turns out, true. We're all slightly different. The firing tables are all slightly different. So we've learned that there's a need to have discussions about commonality and interoperability of those combat supplies. These discussions need to happen before left and bang, to use an army term, before we're actually in conflict. And so that those patchworks of national supply chains need to be figured out. And to do it collectively means how do we change some issues. And one that often doesn't get thought about, but there's going to need to be a massive inflow of personnel replacements and a massive outflow of casualties into hospitals and national healthcare systems. And I'll just use Canada as a microcosm. Think about the impact of adding another 2,000 or 3,000 casualties to any one given province critical care unit. You can imagine the potential problems. So these are all the kind of things we need to think. So those are the big picture problems. Soldiers are great. NATO's got great trained soldiers and they do great things together at the lower level. But if we're gonna be in a position to demonstrate to Russia and to defend if necessary, we're going to need to make sure all those other enabling things are in place to allow the soldiers to do what they need. And what I would argue is all those problems I just rattled off, hopefully they didn't make it too negative, but all those big problems I rattled off, they're military problems because we need to fix them, but they can't be solved by people in uniform. They've got significant policy implications. They've got significant political implications. And quite frankly, industry has a big role in solving a lot of it. So an example of a solution that's taking place in the Netherlands, where most of the ports are now operated by private enterprises. The Dutch government has engaged and put contracts in place with those various organizations in a number of ports that say under these conditions, we will be allowed access to these berths, these areas for the hubs. And they're entering into a contract where they're paying money now to guarantee access later. And they're working with the Belgians and the Germans to develop a transportation corridor that smooths everything through. And the next step, and I know they're already talking to our Polish friends, but extending that whole process in the forward. And that's being multiplied multiple times. But all of those are, they're hard to unlock because they do involve multiple government departments, multiple governments, private industry. So there's big roles there. So, and the final thing I'll go to, and then we go to questions, which will be really interesting. So what does this kind of mean for Canada? How does Canada play into this? So I think the increased funding in defense, we talked about it a lot. Certainly it's very, very low. The point made this morning about how defense doesn't spend all its money is 100% true. We're always leaving money behind. There's a bunch of reasons. What I would say is a lot of the increased funding, certainly in the short term, will address immediate today concerns. Things like not having enough spare parts, like having buildings that are falling down, paying our soldiers, those are real world problems. Because we're really good at buying fancy, shiny things. We're really a lot less good about buying the parts that are going to be needed to keep those things going forward. But there is process for it. So defense has to fix some of its own internal processes. But to be honest, the machinery of government is not set up to spend money fast. And even with the Defense Industrial Agency, you still need Privy Council office, you still need Treasury Board, you still need Department of Finance, and you need the Prime Minister's office to all be on board to move this stuff forward. Or the money's not going to get spent in kind of time. So it's often thought about give defense money, defense can go spend it, but we need a whole bunch of other people rowing in the same direction, or else we're just going to spin in circles. A lot of that money, a lot of what the government talks about is that money will drive growth of our defense industry, which is great. That will drive productivity in Canada, which is great. We also need to figure out, sort of what I just said, how that helps assist the collective NATO defense capability, which is not something we're talking about. For us to operate in Europe and support a NATO, some of that money is going to have to get spent outside of the country. So it's something I mentioned. German policies, processes, bureaucratic culture. An example, just because I like to throw this example of, are no strong and freer defense policy in 2024. For example, in it, there was 1.74 billion over 5 years to bring up our ammunition stocks. As of my retirement at the end of August, we don't have any of that money yet in the hands of defense. They're hoping to do a trigger board submission this fall. That kind of pace and procedure needs to change, or we're not going to get ahead. We're not going to make use of the defense on the Republican thing. And the last thing, sort of a Canadian implication, is we need to understand that we are a little bit unique among some of the neighbors. We're not incontinent. And our military and our defense thinking has not been entirely with NATO. Many of our European allies, the decisions they make on capability development and on structure are driven by defending their country and contributing to NATO. Whereas Canada's has been a little bit more diverse. Five Eyes work, NORAD, Indo-Pacific, North. We need to make sure that we're focusing enough on the NATO problem and understand that ours is made a bit more complicated by that thing called the Atlantic. And that anything that we're doing here, defense industrial perspective, if it's needed to contribute to NATO and the European fight, it's going to have to go across the Atlantic. An Atlantic Ocean that may or may not be contested. Fighting the Russians, my guess is that they're going to contest it. And so that's going to force us to start thinking about pre-positioning, about industrial capability in continental Europe by Canadian companies and presence to support what we're doing. So that's all just a different way of thinking. And that's, to be fair, that's a little bit of Scott McKenzie's rambling, but I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about these specific problems in particular. So I guess if I could summarize before we go into questions. So Canada is very much engaged with assisting NATO with its operational readiness and preparation. More engaged than we've ever been during the 36 years I spent. More focused. There's still a lot of work to do, but we are definitely moving in the right direction. And there are significant roles to play for people in the policy environment, in academic discourse, and in industry to support the evolution of kind of change and modernization we need to do to contribute to NATO in a way that is worthy of a nation that is the number 6 economy and the number 7 by population in NATO, small country, broken player, and to contribute the way our allies expect and which we should expect from ourselves. There's a bunch of work to do and a lot of good things from to contribute.
Q&A. So we'll collect a few questions and his Christian, just wait for the microphone.
Great observations. So I guess we can sum it up that the situation is desperate but not hopeless. So this, I guess, to our 3 Canadian guests and to the ambassador, because there's a corollary to this question. And the question has 2 parts. One is that we spent 25 plus years putting in place policies and procedures
with the intention of shrinking the organization, and as you pointed out, impeding it from spending money, and with the intent that money flows back to the government. So this was by design, not by consequence. So I think Ben has the right observation, he has the wrong diagnosis. And my sense is that unless the government is prepared to take more political, financial, and reputational risk, we can have all the plans, strategies, monies, and intentions that we want. We will not be able to execute. The corollary to that is this, that on a good day, the Canadian Armed Forces can muster 8 CF-18s, 3 frigates, 1 submarine, and 20 to 100 infantry. The United Kingdom, with a GDP 30% larger than Canada's, can muster 2 carriers, a strike group, nuclear submarines, and 10,000 deployable expeditionary personnel. What is it going to take for us to actually get serious about gaining the initiative and shaping the environment? Because that's why the UK is investing, especially now that it's out of the EU, because it knows it needs to be active and it needs to have agency. From what I've heard here, there's no real conversation about Canada regaining agency and the ability to assert its interests. Because we're not investing presumably to defend. Arguably, we don't want to be defending anything. Defending is politically, financially, socially really costly. Right? As you pointed out, we want to deter, but really what we want to do is assert Canadian interests. And I haven't seen anything here that really convinces me that we're committed to being a country of our size in the world that is actually able and willing to build the capabilities through instruments of statecraft, arguably the most important instrument of statecraft being the Canadian Armed Forces, via NATO to be able to assert those interests. And the reason why it's so nice to have the ambassador here is because Poland has been able to do both of those things. Poland has aggressively invested in the instruments of statecraft, and Poland aggressively changed, as far as I can tell, its policies and procedures to be able to do that in record time. So what can we learn from Poland, and what is it going to take for us to actually get serious?
Thank you. Yes, here.
Hello, I'm a first year MA student here at Carleton. Thank you so much. These were really insightful observations and very interesting. I had a question for General Scott McKenzie. I found your point about needing to coordinate different supply chains in terms of forces and standardizing equipment and everything, a very compelling point. I wanted to sort of ask, currently, right now, what are the biggest obstacles in these countries being able to coordinate the various different logistical enablers that they need to? Is it lack of will? Is it financial constraint, procedural issues, and then need for a culture change? Like, what is sort of the biggest obstacle that you can identify right now? And I mean, this is as well to anybody else.
Yes.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I have a question about more of a long-term threat landscape. We know that Russia is now posing a severe threat to NATO, Europe, and invading Ukraine. But Russia is facing a demographic collapse. Its economic resource is being bled dry. Its international proxies in the Middle East are collapsing one by one. So in the long-term future, it is unlikely to be a very powerful country compared to what is capable of mastering in the short term. Meanwhile, China is rising and becoming more assertive and more dominant in the field of economics and technology. I know that NATO focused on Europe, but I wonder in the long term, would NATO be concerned with a conjoint threat of Russia and China, and especially with the weight in Asia Pacific? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, the last question is the first round in the back, so it's, I think we have time for.
Thank you for the panel. I just wanted to know, because for our first question, I feel like, challenge the policy and practitioner side of things. I'm wondering if we could also reverse that. What is the one thing that you wish academics would tell you to help you in your work as well?
Okay. So the same order, maybe you can take a turn and answer the question that you feel you have addressed. About 2 minutes the speaking.
Thank you so much. Before I answer the questions, let me just add 2 points. First, the the military cooperation between our militaries, Polish and Canadian, and in the region. The president's, my understanding is that the Canadian military presence outside of Canada is the biggest in Central Eastern Europe, in Latvia, and this is, I need to flag this, this is very much appreciated. Obviously in Poland and Central Europe, we are cooperating with our militaries, so we have our armor company in Latvia under Canadian command. We're doing things for Ukrainians in Poland together, and there are many things. And right now we are working very closely, and we are engaged in working with our military industries and looking for options to work for synergy in this regard. This is absolutely crucial. And I'll go to the questions. Well, thank you for the first question. And I think we have to be very sincere about the situation we are in. And thank you for those statistics that you presented and the analysis. I think they're, you're on point. We've been as NATO, as the Western world, we've been feeling too good for so many years. We appreciated our condition, our situation. We spectacularly over-exaggerated our capabilities, and that includes Poland. But back in the day, now we all understand the situation. But I also, I had a sense, oh wow, we're so the V4 countries should, if there was a problem, we could stand up to Russia. No, entire NATO except for the United States. We're proven wrong because that group, we simply don't even have ammunition to fight. I mean, in terms of manpower, in terms of ammunition, in terms of many other aspects, we learned that we are weak, and we have to be using as you have used. We have to be using strong words to understand and to persuade not only ourselves because we understand it, but our societies that a certain investment is needed. We enjoyed looking at our state-of-the-art modern equipment, but the war, or the Russian war against Ukraine, proved that the modern equipment is nice, but the numbers are still more important. So if you can continue shelling a city with not really caring whether you will hit the thing that you're aiming at for a couple of years, you're better off than having a couple of wonderful howitzers that can spectacularly shoot at one point, but you just don't have the ammo to keep shelling. So thank you for saying what you said, because it's very important for us not to stop feeling good about our and then lessons from Poland. This is really tough because we are in a very different situation. Poland has a history of being in the recent century attacked, oppressed, destroyed, murdered in millions. Only during the Second World War, 6 million Poles were killed. Only during that time. So our history puts us in a very different position, in a position of a society which understands the significance of security and significance of the necessity to fight for your freedom. So it's the decisions in democratic countries, the decision that we're talking about, the investment, comes from society, and governments, as we know well, have to be empowered by our people to commit to those investments. So in this area, it's we can show, and I'm very happy that it's the things that Poland has done in recent years has been presented well in Canadian media and by the experts, and I don't know whether Canada can learn from that, but it is an example. But it comes from those the fundamental reasons for us operating the way we do are slightly different. So I very much respect the Canadian society. I understand the different position you were in, and I'm very happy to see that there is progress, and the current government is showing that progress. And there's definitely understanding among experts for a long time. So this is something that I appreciate very much.
And the last point, academic debates, thank you. This is very important. And I've seen over the couple of years that I'm here, I've seen a big difference. And the fact that on the level of academia, that understanding of significance of security it re-entered universities that were engaged in many other topics. This is very significant. The panel that we had before is a very good example of that. So there's always, I mean, the way well, practice government people talk to each other, the way experts talk to each other, and the way academics talk to each other. These are very different things, but everybody has a role to play, and I'm very happy to see that there is a synergy among those groups. So this is very much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you, Bachelor. Thank you for the questions. All really good ones. I think on the first one, you know, you're right in a way. Threats have been far from us, and so you know, since the end of the Cold War, we've still been, you know, sort of riding that peace dividend and being able to invest in other things. But you know, the security environment has changed and is changing much more dramatically. And yes, Europe is kind of on the front line, but the threats are also getting closer to Canada. And so, you know, I think what we're seeing is that start of that sea change. We've got a ways to go. But, you know, you look at, as the general mentioned, you know, Canada is different than other allies. First of all, geography, we're huge. Climate, very rough. And demography, frankly, we're very small or very sort of located in a particular corridor. So our defense needs are going to be different. And that's part of the conversation I think that we're all having, that D&D is going to be having as part of government, how we go about to invest in what we need to protect ourselves while still remaining a net contributor to European security, as we have been for, you know, over the last century. But it does mean that there will be some adaptation. And I think, you know, again, we're at the start of this conversation in Canada, maybe late to the party. But you know, there is a prise de conscience where the government has sort of really taken on board, one, to agree and be firm to commit to the percentage, which hasn't always been the case. And then two, to put in place, or start to put in place some of the tools, the Defense Investment Agency, for example, which is intended to streamline procurement and to fast track things. And there's a real discussion on procurement to get away from, you know, the challenges of the past 20 years, which was, let's not buy anything, just produce it. And there's also work underway for defense investment strategy, sort of to grow Canadian defense area. So, you know, I take some of the points, but at the same time, I think there's progress that is happening, or that will be happening, and because there is really this in the consensus that is happening. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. So I'll hit a few of them in order. So to the first one, I mean, Christian, you're right to be skeptical. I mean, academic reflection back to especially defense bureaucrats, I mean, fish in a barrel, there's a lot to pick from in terms of telling us what we can be doing better, and we're definitely listening. I'm not sure that I would entirely agree that by design, any government has meant to include spending that it authorized. That's a little Machiavellian. But certainly our processes have been optimized in past for due diligence rather than for speedy delivery. And it's something we talk about a lot, and we're recognizing that that's just contextual. Like right now, maybe we need to shift the balance a little bit and be focused on speedy delivery. Hopefully not with sacrificing all due diligence, but maybe putting it at a different sort of hierarchy or prioritization. I would say too that you have to be careful comparing one ally against another. I mean, we have shared outcomes, but you know, I mean, and you teach at a great military institution, so you'll know this, but you have to measure a military against its missions. you cannot measure a military against another military or a military against something unless it's held in past. The only question that matters from a practitioner standpoint is, do we have the military to accomplish the thing that the government asks it to accomplish, or that Canadians ask it to accomplish? I'm not saying that Canada necessarily stacks up better in that rubric than in, comparing us against the UK or France or any other. I'm just saying that you have to start with the right question in order to get to the right answer. And for me, it's always, do we have what we need to do what Canadians are asking us to do? In terms of seriousness, I mean, I am personally, this is a very personal reflection, I'm personally quite oppressed, I would say, by the seriousness of this government's commitment. We have committed to spending over $9 billion in defense inside 10 months. That's incredibly ambitious. The budget that was just announced earlier this week, I mean, quite large numbers. But what jumped out more for me was the percentage of the overall 5-year spending total that would be coming to defense. I certainly don't remember that much of the responsibility and seriousness being put on the Department of Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces out before. And it is something that I said in my remarks that we take very seriously. We need to execute those funds with the same seriousness with which the government invested. That or will invest them in our organization. So I don't know if it's seriousness. I think it's a question of, now that our purpose is clear, the Prime Minister's purpose is clear, which is to rearm, to rebuild, to reinvest, and also to do it in a way that diversifies our defense partnerships and does so to the maximum benefit of all Canadians comprehensively, with their comprehensive security in mind. It's a question of, how quickly can we get that done? We're quite focused. Of course, we're going to make mistakes, but I'm quite optimistic that there's no lack of seriousness or purpose. On logistics obstacles, I'm going to leave that for Scott, but I just will say from a policy perspective, the short answer to your question is just, it's really hard. It's really hard. And somebody in the earlier session talked about the multinational brigade as being really laboratory for that. I agree with that. I was in Riga myself a couple of weeks ago. I think on the ground, they're learning every day about what interoperability takes. And the hardest part is interoperability requirements 3 weeks ago isn't necessarily going to be the requirement 6 months from now. And whenever you're actually asked to mobilize against, to counter some kind of operation. So on the trade-off between Russia and China, I don't like to entertain that kind of dichotomy myself. We're seeing more and more. We used to talk about 2 years ago, that the invasion of Ukraine was a demonstration that the principle of sovereignty could be contradicted, and that if we didn't resist Russia's illegal invasion, that it would be a bad example for the rest of the world. I think we've moved on from that, but what's happening in Ukraine isn't just about an example. We have Russia actively interacting with other partners materially. They're learning from each other. They're sharing technology. They're sharing concepts and doctrine. They're helping each other get better to do things that are directly against our national interests and the safety and security of the alliance. So there might be a question about, hey, where's the best place for alliance members to apply for and share contention based on our capabilities and our geography. But I don't think it's a trade-off between which one it should be focused on. Clearly, the answer is both, because they are focused on each other and together we're focused on us. I really appreciate the question about what academics can do better. Forums like this are excellent. The interchange between academia and bureaucracy is something Canada could get better at. We can benefit from one another. I think this conversation is really helpful. And in terms of the things that I find most useful are just really data-driven analysis, counter creativity, and also focusing on the how. Not just the that something should be this, that, or the other, but getting a level deeper to give a little bit of creativity to how we could achieve a thing. I think that's always appreciated. And of course, inspire others. Young people, new scholars, Canadians on large. We appreciate that you do that work. Yeah, we'd like to say thank you.
Thank you. So again, before I start talking, I will put the caveat that I'm a retired chairman. and my thoughts are not represented necessarily in cabinet policy. upfront, I do want to acknowledge Ambassador, like one of the good things. We don't like to talk about it, but there are some good things. If anything, it's reoriented our understanding of the threats in Russia, the good things like conflict in Ukraine. The Polish-Canadian relationship, certainly at the military level, has developed fantastically over the past few years. Canada could not have provided the kind of support that we continue to do Ukrainians without the assistance of both. They've housed us. For those that don't know, like our training element was in Ukraine up until 3 days before Russia invaded. They literally, literally, this keeps turning off. I'm just going to talk about it. Literally, our folks sort of ran out with what the rucksacks on their backs and not much else, and they were housed in full. So, thank you all.
It
says, yeah, now, oh, there we go. I was going to say, it's not the mic, it's the user thereof. So thank you very much, Ambassador, again, on behalf of Canadians. Done
Most of the things you said about Poland were not recorded. That's the Russian intervention.
So to Christian's question, and it's kind of been addressed. So I agree with the vast majority of your assertions. It's very, you know, we're Canadians, we're far away, we're in the planet with this, blah, blah, blah. I think to add some extra context to it, this is a country who doesn't understand the privations of war on the home front, because the folks that understood it during First World War, Second World War, to a limited extent Korea, have passed on. Living memory is basically gone. And the last sort of real conflict we would have in Afghanistan, quite frankly, for most Canadians, was a war that somebody else was doing that was impacting somebody else. And unless you had a direct family member or you had a CAF member in your family, you didn't even really feel that conflict. And certainly economically, business front, there wasn't an impact on things. So until people don't understand the privations of what a conflict could bring, and therefore what the true value of preparing for it. Can the government change that dialogue? I think they can, if they really, really want to. And I would use, I think the discussions, the maturity of the discussions in this country around Indigenous relations have come massively in the last 10, 15 years. That's because the government really started talking about it, thought it was important, and wanted to get it in Canadians' minds. If they believe defense and security is really that important, they can start talking about it, they can turn it. That's mine. But everybody in this room that attends something like this and goes and talks about it, posts on LinkedIn or whatever else you do, that advances the discussion. So it's got to be grassroots, but the government's got to enable it. So the supply chain issue. So it is hard. I'm not going to leave it just there. I'll go on a little bit. So there's a couple of aspects. One of it, quite frankly, is the simple one of awareness. People just having to think of it. Because we've been getting away for the last couple of decades, like 90% of my military career, getting together for exercises, supplying ourselves in common. To an extent, it's kind of the problem we have with operating in the north as well, in northern Canada. We go up, we take all our stuff up there because it's not there, we bring it all home. Do it again. It's a flipping of the script to say, okay, we actually have a problem where we need to set things up so we can sustain ourselves there long term. To do it collectively, so NATO knows this, lots of supporters like me back in quiet rooms talk about it. It's probably only really getting on commanders' radar screens about how fraught we are with lack of ammunition and lack of access to fuel. So now it's the tactical play. Now, where do we get to the hard part? The hard part is when we get into national interests, right? So who's going to pay for a fuel stockpile? Who is going to be the person who gets paid to provide the fuel stockpile? That's where actual countries' interests get in mind. Who's going to financially benefit? Does Canada want to spend $100 million to buy a bunch of fuel that's going to sit in Europe, that's going to be drawn on by the European countries? Right? I think that's probably not a bad idea. It's paying down, it's like insurance for the house, right? Insurance, fire insurance is really useful, but it's, you don't like paying it, so your house burns. Then it's great. But those are small p political decisions. And then in a lot of countries, there's contracting regulations, there's financial expenditure regulations that make it hard to move money. NATO has a common funding mechanism, but NATO has been trying to enlarge that funding envelope, both in terms of dollars or euros, and what it could be used for. But you need 32 nations to kind of agree to that. Canada's not exactly been a champion of growing the common funding, but that is one of the problems. So it's complicated. But increasingly, folks realize the need to get there. And I'd say particularly for a lot of the European nations, it's also trying to balance what does their sovereign national strategic supplies look like, and how much of that can be sort of committed to NATO and how much to the so it actually is a great subject for some sort of academic discussion. The Russia-China thing, that's a lot of policy space, so I gotta be super careful. But from a practitioner perspective, there's undoubtedly a linkage between China and Russia. China is enabling what Russia is doing, either directly, openly, or not. And they're kind of seeing each other, they're friends with convenience, don't get me wrong, they're not best friends. And increasingly Russia is a junior partner, which I think makes the Russians feel very unhappy. But I think I go back to where Canada fits compared to like what Canadian military folks talk and some other of the European nations. We feel it more because we're Five Eyes people. So we're looking that direction, where a lot of other NATO allies are very focused on Russia, rightly so. And so I think there's still, I think some NATO nations are very focused on two bi-coastal problem, I guess, if I could put it that way, where others are a little more focused on the here and now for a lot of reasons. So I'll leave there. And academics, like personally, me, I champion any academic article I see on national defense and security in this country because there's far too few. And there's a million things we could study. Canada's role in defending itself is a great one. I was involved a little bit in some of the initial defense industrial strategy discussions and under the idea of what is a sovereign capability? What do we need to have? Those are real academic questions as well as very fruitful. The North, I think how, if you looked at NATO specifically, how NATO makes decisions as a political entity. The military is just a component. And how it will make decisions in a more dynamic environment where the space between war and peace is not a fire. And the hybrid activities ongoing today in Europe, be they unofficial sabotage and all sorts of other things that are going on, how NATO influences those activities, again, I'll use the phrase left of bang, before tanks are rolling across frontiers. I think is a really interesting sort of question to pursue. And I think I'll leave it there.
On that note, thanking all our panelists. Hope to see you other more events. And thank you for coming, and please follow us on the website and social media. There's a lot of research, quick note, policy briefs that might be of interest related to security in general, not only from a NATO perspective. So, and we are planning other events as well. So information. Thank you for coming.